Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me today. We are going to do a live Q&A, and I will be taking all of your questions, and I won't be lecturing on anything specific. So, how you get your question in the queue is you actually have to click the link in the chat. There'll be a link in the chat to my website, and you just submit it into our little form there. And we do it that way just because we are streaming simultaneously on several different platforms, and it's hard for the mods to grab the questions and send them to me. So that way, all the questions are in one place and they get seen. So we've already had the form open for about an hour. So we have already some incredible questions coming in. So let's dive right in. This question is from Kate Redleaf. What is the nature of deities? Are they separate, external beings, or are they more of an internal archetype we connect to from within? Modern pagans and witches claim to work with deities from pantheons around the world. Would love to hear your take on what they're truly interacting with. Thanks for your thoughts. I appreciate what you do so much. Well, thank you, Kate Redleaf. So, the answer to this question, and so many questions like this, is actually understanding, I would say, the dynamics of the spiritual hierarchies. So, the spiritual hierarchies includes beings that would be considered elementals. So, um, the beings that make up the elements. They're also called nature spirits or sometimes divas. And these entities are more like they're the entities that sort of appear as our collective unconscious, as Jung would say. These are the entities that make up the gnomes or the sylphs or the nature spirits, but also they help to create like a shell, an etheric shell, an appearance for spiritual beings and things like that. So they give things shape and form, but they're actually living entities. It's actually a living essence. Okay. And then there are also beings that would be considered celestial beings. So these are not nature spirits per se, they're not elementals in the traditional sense, they're actually angels. Now, there's been many different terms for angels depending on the esoteric tradition. In the Eastern tradition, they're often called Dhyani Kohans. They're kind of lumped in with divas as well. And Manasaputras. There's all these different words, Petries. That's in the Eastern tradition. Now, those are actual beings or entities, usually when they're interacting with humanity. So, and there's several different hierarchies of angels. Now, angels are different than elementals, yet they work together to create certain experiences in ceremonial rites or in spiritual connection. So I would say there that when you're looking at modern paganism, it is such a different thing than what paganism was a long time ago, thousands and thousands of years ago. Humanity had a different kind of consciousness in which humanity could kind of project themselves into nature. They could sort of merge with and harmonize with nature. And now I developed more of an individuality. So we don't actually operate like that as much. It's part of what we can do to a degree, but that's not actually how we evolve. So modern day paganism is actually something very, very, very different than the original pagan traditions would have been. The original paganism does not exist anymore. And that's really important to know because the consciousness in which that original kind of pagan worship was completely different than where we are now. And this is the first thing to understand in serious esoteric study, is that as consciousness evolves, our understanding of the spiritual planes and spiritual entities evolves. And so you don't look at something as one thing, but you look at it as an evolution. So in very early pagan times, we would see, personified versions of the wind. We'd see personified versions of different natural phenomenon that was basically pretty much elemental spirits, sometimes taking a form that would allow us to see our own consciousness, our own relationship with God. And then sometimes it wouldn't be elementals, it would be actual gods, it would be actual angels that were kind of communicating with us, overshadowing us, working with us. So it's both. And the secret to understanding this is to understand the teachings of the elementals and understand the teachings of the celestial hierarchies or the angels. That's the only way to really get into this in a meaningful way. All right. And by the way, happy St. Patrick's Day to everyone. I hope you guys out there are all wearing green. And maybe we'll have some St. Patty's Day questions, although I do have some Irish blood, I wouldn't consider myself an expert on St. Patrick, but here we are. Okay, this is a member question. And you said, in esoteric groups I follow, there are a lot of people identifying as Gnostics. Given that Steiner said no true Gnosticism can exist after the time of Christ, what is this modern form of Gnosticism? Okay, so Gnostic means to be a Gnostic or Gnosticism is basically about wisdom. It is a wisdom-oriented tradition and field. It's about knowledge. It's sort of about the idea sometimes is that knowledge alone is enough to initiate you. Sometimes in modern Gnosticism, it's almost like a very high-level form of paganism, actually, in that it gets you so far into spiritual initiation, but then kind of stops. And why I believe Rudolf Steiner said this is that knowledge is not enough. So it doesn't matter how much you understand the demiurge, or that the world is a simulation, or the different, degrees of the spiritual planes, or the different entities and things like that. That's not actually enough to evolve your soul. Knowledge is not enough. And this is where Luciferianism falls short as well. Knowledge is not enough. It doesn't matter how much you know about something. This is just the mind. The mind can't fully bring you into a higher level of initiation within your soul. For that, you need love. And this is where Christ comes in. This is where the Christ enters. This is where it enters humanity, and it is where it is today in our heart. So knowledge is not enough. It doesn't matter how many books you read, right? Like, how many people do you know that have a knowledge-based spiritual understanding yet have no morality? And so when Christ comes in, basically the incarnation of the Christ being in Jesus, when that comes in, humanity had already, in earlier periods, sort of explored all of the natural world and had incredible knowledge. I mean, think about the Library of Alexandria. Think about how knowledgeable we've been in Atlantis. So we actually have a lot of knowledge, and a lot of that knowledge isn't even esoteric anymore. It's exoteric. It's just we're not really putting it together necessarily yet. But the point, I believe, of that statement is to say that knowledge is not enough. We actually have to become moral. We have to become loving and even be of service. And that is where the initiating principle is. And that is oftentimes the difference between Gnosticism and mystical Christianity, or anything that really acknowledges Christ. Now, there are some Gnostic groups that do acknowledge Christ. And in that, you could say that it is a kind of, really a kind of Christianity. And I don't want to say that there's no value to Gnosticism. I don't believe that. I think that there's value inherently and an importance to every single esoteric tradition. I think they hold important keys. I think they represent certain phases of human development. And I don't think at all that any of them should be put down or so that they're not useful. But for this question in particular, we're contrasting the reality of Christ, and that's not often accepted in many modern Gnostic teachings. Christ is often reduced to like the same impact as the Buddha or Krishna, when Krishna, the Buddha, and Jesus were completely different individuals at different levels of initiation with different tasks that need to individually be understood. So there's often a conflation of all great initiates as the same kind of thing when they're not. And also, many times in Gnosticism, just the life and impact of Christ is not fully understood, which is something that Rudolf Steiner sought to bring forward through anthroposophy. So that's what I would say about modern Gnosticism. And modern Gnosticism is also where we get things like the simulation theory, where, you know, sometimes, not all Gnostics, but many times Gnosticism tends to be impersonal. And, you know, in esoteric Christianity, we view everything, that behind everything are great beings. The elementals are beings, angels are beings. So in esoteric Christianity, we don't view the world as a simulation, as a machine. Only the lower astral plane and the lower aspects of like the inner earth or the subnatural world have a machine quality. So if you were to only look at the world in the lower astral plane and in the subnatural worlds, you would see that as a machine. But the moment that you include the heavens, the higher, the Devacon, the higher worlds, then you begin to see it is not a simulation, it is not a machine, it is great beings. And if you only see a portion of that great being, it looks just like you're looking at an organ, which it looks like a machine, but it's actually a great being. And we are actually inside of a great being right now, the great cosmic man. We are a microcosm of that. So the other different thing besides that, in mystical Christianity, we acknowledge that the knowledge is not enough. Doesn't really matter like how much you know. Yes, there's value in that, but you have to become moral. You have to become a moral human being, ethical. And that is how human beings and evolution happens. You have to understand deeply what it means to be moral and why it matters, right? Which is to really tame and overcome the Luciferic knowledge impulse that's inverted right now in the world and humanity. All right. And so the other thing, again, that I really find stands out a lot is the simulation thing, which is like the idea of the matrix, and just that small little aspect is being called the entire cosmos, which is incorrect. The cosmos is best understood esoterically as beings. We are within great beings. And the processes that we see are their consciousness, their mind. So we can't view the cosmos as an inhuman entity, like a machine, a simulation. It's actually very bad for your spirit. You have to view it as a great being, because we are beings and everything, we are in that image. So this is where Christianity comes in, and that everything is a being. It's very human, compassion, ethics, and everything is beings. And so some Gnostic systems may recognize that, and that's great. But there's also many that do not, and they get caught up in sort of this different cosmology that doesn't include the principle of initiation in it at all. It's just sort of knowledge-based. Curious Cat. Hello, Gigi. I have heard that Edgar Cayce built his center at Virginia Beach because the area is a portal for the Great White Brotherhood. Could you please tell any insights you have about that and the area? I am visiting there soon and would like to know how to best connect to them and be of service to that energy. Well, that's lovely. It is a beautiful area of the States. So Virginia Beach actually has an unusually high level of gold in the sand and in the water there, which is fascinating because gold is essentially the solar metal. Gold represents the sun. As you may know, every single planetary sphere has a metal that is attributed to it. So the gold that we have on the Earth resonates in a mineral sense as the sun. And the Great White Brotherhood is a solar entity. It is a group of saints or masters. These are human beings who have reached an exalted level of initiation. So the Great White Brotherhood, like in our day and age, I have literally seen people be like, the Great White Brotherhood is about like white people, like it as though it's like some kind of racist organization. We become so saturated in this like topic that it's seeping into the most innocent, innocuous things. The Great White Brotherhood does not refer to skin color. Okay. The Great White Brotherhood is referring to the white light or the white sun. It is referring to the pure light of the solar force or the Christ impulse. And white light is, it's sort of, bastardized now in the New Age, but that's what it has always represented. So the Great White Brotherhood is a system of initiation. It's part of a system of initiation we have within humanity, where the idea is once you reach a certain level of exaltation within your soul, you transcend matter to varying different degrees and you become a master, what we would call a master. In the Eastern traditions, you would say bodhisattva or you would say Buddha. That's the Great White Brotherhood. That's the same thing under a different name. So and of course that makes sense. I mean, unless people want to believe that like human beings don't ever evolve and there is no such thing as spiritual initiation, there's no such thing as evolution, then of course there's going to be spiritual initiates that transcend matter and that then serve humanity. And of course that's going to be some kind of organization because harmony is law. Right. So this actually also, in my opinion, makes a lot of logical sense, even though I feel like the concept has become kind of bizarre and ridiculed, unfortunately, even though it is really important for us to understand. So Edgar Cayce was in communication with the Great White Brotherhood or these ascended masters. And Rata, in his past life, he was also very connected with this group. And that often happens is that, once you are initiated into that system, it will, follow you life after life, and you will have opportunities to work with it life after life. So, yeah, I would say just enjoy that area and enjoy going to I believe he has a center there where you can check out his material, and I think it's called the ARE. I would say just enjoy it. I mean, it's an incredible place. This is a member question. What do you know about the occult history and significance of St. Patrick's Day, the four-leaf clover, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and leprechauns? Is there any connection between Atlantis and Christianity? Thank you. Great question. I knew there was going to be a St. Patrick's Day question in here somewhere. As we're all wearing our green and drinking green drinks and all that stuff. I guess not really, but it's happening somewhere. So St. Patrick is obviously an Irish saint, and he is famous for, I think, actually being a slave and being liberated from slavery and finding Christ. And then he became so adept at preaching and teaching the word that he was looked upon incredibly highly. And then he ends up casting the serpents from Ireland. And so there's all these images of St. Patrick, and he's like sitting on, the beautiful, hills of Ireland, and he's casting out these serpents. And that is representative of the removal of certain darker pagan practices from Ireland, because whenever there's a shift in human consciousness, there's a shift in religions. There's a shift in spiritual belief. And there has to be, because the spiritual system has to evolve a little bit in order to incorporate the new organs and dynamics that the human being has now come into. So human consciousness evolves over time. And really, in anthroposophy, we observe that there's actually new organs that are created every couple hundred years. So if you were to actually look at a body that was like a cadaver and look at the brain of it from a couple hundred years ago, you would notice couple different structures in the brain then than today. Okay. So the body actually changes and shifts over time, believe it or not, in small, very, very, very small ways. And also the mind and the spiritual organs begin to almost overwrite themselves and open in certain ways, and others close. People talk about this in the sense of like, we used to be so clairvoyant in the Atlantean era, and even in the Greco-Roman era, people used to see all of these spiritual beings and angels and demonic entities. There's a whole different system, but then we lost that. Yes, that's because those organs atrophied as new ones were developed. So we can even see in our own reality that there is shifting in our perception that's very obvious. It's very clear. Now we're in this materialism, and we have sort of a body that's very dense and heavy, and that is completely overdeveloped in this material sense, that's now almost regaining higher versions of certain organs, if you will. So that has an intense effect on our spirituality because it affects our perspective. And all religious systems are basically based around the consciousness of humanity at that time. And there's an objective spiritual science or esoteric science that all religions ultimately adhere to, because there are objective spiritual laws. And all religions are interpreting the objective spiritual laws of reality in a way that consciousness can grow and benefit from. Now, obviously, in dark ages, they get corrupted and all of that. But why I'm saying this is because people, I feel like, we want to put things as fragments, and that hurts us. So we have to see things as an evolution always. So when St. Patrick's casts the serpents from Ireland, what he's doing is he's removing the dark aspects and the dark kind of organs within the human being that are associated with pagan practices. Okay, so he's casting that out. Now, the serpent is viewed differently in different esoteric traditions. Okay, so the serpent is viewed differently in Christianity, especially dogmatic Christianity, than it would be in Hinduism or Buddhism. In earlier traditions, humanity was in a more innocent state. So the serpent was viewed as just Kundalini life force, basically. However, as we move forward, we sink deeper and deeper into matter, and you can't just view your own mind and your own Kundalini life force as pure. So we start to see our own shadow self, and this really begins to happen in around the incarnation of Christ and forward. We begin to really see our own shadow, our own evil, and that's why you see, the increase of Manichaeism 300 years after Christ, which is all about duality. You see the intense duality in Christianity. More so, Christianity as a mystical system, confronts evil more than any other system does. We see that because it becomes about purification suddenly. It was not about purification 5,000 years ago. It was about gathering knowledge and understanding of the world and who we are. But now that we have that, there is the need to purify, because with that, we've also sunk and we've become fallen in a sense, because everybody has done dark deeds, not understanding. And so we've kind of fallen into what would be sin. And so this means that in dogmatic Christianity and even in sort of esoteric Christianity, the serpent is not just seen as only positive as it is in Eastern traditions. It's seen as that's observed and understood, right? That's not missing from the teaching. But we also add something new in that you don't think that just your energy is just 100% pure. You don't think the serpent of life just runs through your system as a completely pure, perfect being. We're fallen now. That's acknowledged in mystical Christianity. And we have to purify ourselves through love and through service. And so the serpent is observed as a holy thing still. We understand that. But we also know that we have to purify ourselves, which means shadow work, healing our trauma. So when St. Patrick cast the serpents out of Ireland, what's really going on there is he's casting out the darker practices of paganism, like sacrifice. You know, the pre-Christian world had fallen into a lot of degeneracies that are now rising. Does that mean that every single person who is into Wicca or into a pagan tradition is like out in their backyard, you know, sacrificing animals and has like a Moloch statue? No, that's not what that means. That's not even a reasonable thing to say. But what it does mean is that every single tradition has a dark aspect. And the dark aspect of paganism was sacrifice, the sacrifice of animals, the sacrifice of human beings, a lot of different kinds of immoralities that were very damaging to the soul. You know, they would do incredibly things that we would consider incredibly dark that I'm not even going to get into here. So that was what various different Christian saints were doing, was removing the dark aspects. And we will go through a period where the dark aspects of dogmatic Christianity will be cast out. You better believe it. All of the shame that exists within the dogmatic system needs to be cast out today in dogmatic Christianity, the way that St. Patrick's did with the paganism. So this isn't just about paganism. This is about every single system will eventually enter a dark period and will need to be purified by the human mind into something greater, into something truer. Okay, so that's Saint Patrick and the casting out of serpents. And there is a deep connection between Atlantis and Christianity. And you could really just say that the Christ impulse and the Christ being has been active on the earth in every single era of earthly existence. We think about the Christ being today, and we automatically think of one aspect of the being of the Christ being. That is when the Christ being incarnates into a human form, which was Jesus. So when we think about the Christ, we think about Jesus, because that was when the great solar being that is the Christ enters into man, enters into Christ, and then enters into Jesus, and then through Jesus into humanity. So that's what we think of. But in reality, and we've been talking about this a lot actually on my platform, the Christ being has already performed many different sacrifices for humanity before he entered into the human being, the human form. And not only that, but the Christ being has been with the human beings on the earth for ever since the earth came to be and before, because it is the initiating impulse. And so when you get into the esoteric aspect of Christianity and you break through the dogmatic stuff, you actually get a very full and complete and, I think, satisfying system that is really what's going to take us into a higher society, really. Okay. Member. Hi, Gigi. Can you talk more about how we are connected to higher beings and live within them? How we are a part of a soul group and we take turns incarnating, and the things we heal in our incarnations helps our soul group as well. As us as individuals, and what we can count on, and that we can count on each other in a way to heal and ascend. Okay, so this question is about our connection with higher beings and how higher beings, which would be angels, exist within us. And they're depicted as basically operating like around us. But really, it would be actually probably more accurate to depict them as kind of being overshadowing us or standing around us and being part of us. And that's actually how human beings become an initiate and evolve, is through their union with an angel or an archangel. And around that, you have experiences, obviously, with masters or very high adepts that are in the saintly realm. And so you become part of that system. And everybody is somewhere within that system where they're overlapping actually with angels. And so that is actually the best way to view spiritual beings or cosmic beings, is that they actually work through humanity. And this is the reason why I'm talking so much about the alien material, is because it sort of removes the actual process of how you evolve. So it externalizes something that's intrinsically spiritual. It's materializing beings that never ever will be made of earthly matter as you are. And it's also saying that, beings from other worlds can be of an earthly matter when they can't. So this is a very important teaching, because higher beings, celestial beings like angels, they work through humanity. It's darker beings that try to appear externally and sort of control humanity. Now, this is not to say that angels don't appear before you, that, masters can't appear before you. They absolutely can, okay? And they do all the time. People see high spiritual beings all the time. You can get external manifestations. What I'm saying is that there is no progress on the earth, true progress on the earth, unless through a human being. So it's about an initiate. A human being that's exalted is the only thing that's going to change this world, or inspire, or evolve. So you don't have these beings coming around that are doing that for you. It doesn't make any sense unless you're working with like a demonic idea of things. So angels work through humanity overwhelmingly to create actions as part of a sovereign being. Now, angels will also obviously prevent certain things from happening if it's not correct, and they do battles and things like this, and they keep people safe and that. But how things come about in the world, true change, is through human beings, and often human beings who are very high initiates, often, or have some kind of connection to the angelic plane. That's when true change happens. Like true powerful change comes through comes through a human being who has reached an exalted state. Does that make sense? I hope that differentiation makes sense. It sometimes can be challenging to get something across. Yeah, so I hope that makes sense. And we do actually operate in soul groups. And there's a big hint with this in a Rudolph Steiner lecture when he talks about the Elohim, and I believe the moon, and it's in his Genesis book. And in his Genesis book, he talks about the Elohim, and he talks a lot about human initiation. And there's one part where he describes how certain very high initiates actually ended up getting to a certain stage of development where they sort of combined their consciousness in a way. Now, the dark and weird perverted version of this is like uploading your whole personality into like a machine or whatever, so you can play poker with a robot or something stupid. But this is actually different, and it is a spiritual union of individualities. Now, we won't fully understand this until significantly later, for probably thousands of years, and it won't take place for most people until the Jupiter development. But there were beings and people who did reach this in an earlier cycle of human development, where they sort of reached a point where they unified, just as the Elohim are unified in a way. And so there's a whole process with that that sort of becomes the basis of ultimately of a soul group, if that makes sense. And so yeah, it's sort of like that's where I'll go with it. All right, this one is from James. Recently, I was in the British Museum in London, marveling at the Egyptian mummies, statues, and artifacts. I kept thinking that this creature was a remnant of the Atlantean epoch. Could you clarify this and describe how this came to be? For example, I've heard it said that the Vedic culture in India is also an Atlantean remnant. Were there different cultures in that epoch with slightly varied expressions? Yes. So, according to the anthroposophical tradition, we see that the highest of the Atlantean initiates, of the priesthoods, went actually to ancient India and founded that civilization. And this is where you get the idea of the seven rishis, and you see basically all of the Atlantean wisdom being carried over into the East, especially into ancient India. So this really begins in 7000 BC. So quite a long time ago. And that civilization really was about preserving the knowledge and preserving the certain techniques and ways of being. And then there were other groups that went to other places that had a different purpose. There was a stream that also went to Europe. Okay, so the same kind of Atlanteans, but went to Europe. And they started 3 different kinds of mystery schools that specifically were to develop, I believe, the mind and sort of mental patterns, the will, feeling. So they went to Europe and they began to develop mystery school systems that were developing certain qualities. Now, this group was basically going to be the foundation for the next big development. So that was like where the group went, that was going to be the vehicles for the impulse of the new era. Okay. And then there were also different breakaway groups that went to South America, and different places in the world. Obviously, Egypt is part of that, but the Egyptian civilization as we know it is much more, is considered, when it reaches its peak, it's sort of considered later than India. But there were lots of different sort of lesser migrations as well with the Atlantean catastrophe. And so you can see these different incredible, megaliths and things like that. So those are all part of the Atlantean migration and these different breakaway groups that happened. Yeah, so you have sort of, in this way, you have sort of the first period of the post-Atlantean epoch, almost sort of repeating Lemurian Atlantis to a certain degree. And then by the time we get to where we are now, we're really developing something new. And so there's a lot of focus in that period, the Indian epoch, of the preservation of knowledge. Yeah, that is all straight from Atlantis. And it's good that you're asking this question, because so many of us don't know how to deal with the concept of Atlantis. Now, more and more people do, but we see, it seems to be very trendy in the conspiracy world to see something unusual, like, a pyramid, or, something that looks like it was used, like a laser cut a hole in a rock, or a spacecraft, or, or some kind of weird craft that's built, or all these different things. And people are immediately like, well, this is off world. We can't have this. They'll find giant bones or something, irregular shaped skulls. And they're like, well, this has to be an alien. No. Why? It doesn't, it's not even actually weird. I was talking about this last week with my group, and, when you understand that Atlantis existed, that there was a prior civilization, as Dark Journalist says, look at Paulina Zelinsky's work. He's done such a good job of bringing that forward in his Hot Zone episodes. I highly recommend checking out his work around that. I don't think anyone's done any better work than bringing forward Atlantis than Dark Journalist. So go and check out the Hot Zone episodes, and you'll see that there was a prior civilization. So when you understand that, and you see like some giant bones, like as though giants existed, which happened all across America in the 1800s, or you see that there is some kind of covert civilization living in cavern systems, or you see monuments, megalithic monuments that don't make sense for our technology. When you understand Atlantis, that makes complete sense. It makes complete sense why there would be different kinds of human beings. The world of J.R.R. Tolkien makes sense. Pyramids make sense. All the megaliths make sense. All of it makes sense when we understand Atlantis. It doesn't make any sense, and it turns into weird alien lore when we don't understand Atlantis, because we just have to find some weird reason why it's here, which actually is a complete propaganda operation, which I've spoken about at length. So raising awareness about Atlantis is really, really important. Even getting into like genetic modification, that's Atlantis. When we understand that we've already cycled through the same things many different times, then we can jump in and we can prevent things from happening. We can prevent Groundhog's Day, from happening, which is, this reoccurrence. Asylum Dawn. Hi, Gigi. What are your thoughts on simulation theory, NPCs, and free will? Does individual sovereignty really exist, or is it just another archonic delusional construct for those trapped inside Saturn's cube in the endless birth and death samsara cycles? I don't have that perspective at all. Yeah, I don't have that perspective that we're in a prison planet, or like, that we're trapped. I don't have that perspective at all. I take the perspective of initiation. And when you look at everything as though we are evolving through a process of spiritual initiation, then if you look at things as being trapped, you're just looking at it like you're a victim, like as though you're trapped on the earth. What do I do? Get me out of here, the prison planet. I don't believe that that's a healthy mindset, to be honest. I don't think it's accurate. I don't think it's healthy. So the planet originally, if we're going to talk about like a prison planet or not, the planet originally was astral. It was an astral form. And then it materializes into a physical form. And once the planet materializes into a complete peak physicality, it sort of becomes a tomb. The idea of being entombed in matter, Christ rising from the tomb, humanity rising from the tomb, is getting off of the wheel of samsara in Christian mysticism. So you can't really view this as being a prison planet when the whole point of incarnating here is to overcome matter through developing a higher spiritual body called the resurrection body, which is called ascension in the New Age, and getting off the wheel of samsara in the Eastern traditions. It's all the same thing, talked about a little bit differently depending on where humanity was to receive it. Humanity is not necessarily in, humanity can't receive certain teachings unless it's ready. There's even teachings that will come in thousands of years that we can't receive today because we're not prepared, right? So essentially, I see it as an opportunity, and I see it as there are certain qualities that you can develop. You can educate yourself. You can live a certain way. You can become a higher spiritual person, and then you transcend matter, right? So calling it like a prison planet or like this trapping thing, it's insulting your own process, because it's not acknowledging, and it's labeling that that's the whole reason why you're here, is to develop spiritually to the point where you transcend or transubstantiate matter entirely. So that's why I don't really adhere to those kind of terms or that system. It doesn't make much sense to me. The same thing with simulation theory. Actually, if you go onto my YouTube channel, I've already given a 20-minute talk on my position on simulation theory. I also just talked about it 20 minutes ago. So check that out. And NPCs are technically they're also called soulless individuals, or sometimes background characters, and that's a real thing. You can have a person that looks like you, looks like a human being, but there's absolutely no spiritual development that has occurred in that person. And technically, they don't have an individuality or an anthroposophy, what you would call an I or an ego. They don't have that developed in a serious way. And so when you don't have a certain level of spiritual development, or you don't have a certain level of like self-awareness, of I developed and anchored in your being, then that basically leaves you open for anything to come in. And so there's a lot of people that are called NPCs simply because they haven't individuated from uh, basically group consciousness. That's a huge thing too, is that when you don't develop your individuality, that includes things like critical thought, you end up operating like a lemming, like in a group. You have to individuate. And then when you individuate and you become self-conscious and self-aware, you begin to spiritualize yourself, right? So when there are individuals that are not engaged in that process at all to a very high degree, and they can become the playthings for dark essences very easily. And oftentimes it's those experiences that can catalyze the I, actually. Sometimes when you have these dark experiences that seem awful, weirdly, that's when you become stronger and you actually develop your individuality. So probably some of the people who we would call kind of, unfortunately, like an NPC, some will develop an I and will rise out of it and become powerful, and others may completely give up their bodies entirely to dark forces. It just depends. Okay, this is a member question. Steiner said, quote, "When people these days show certain psychic abilities, a certain clairvoyance, without having done serious exercises or studied spiritual science, this does not mean that they are more advanced than everyone else, but rather that they are lagging behind. That this soul shows such abilities means that it has failed to go through certain things that had to be experienced in the age of clairvoyance. Would you elaborate more on this?" When people these days show certain psychic abilities, a certain clairvoyance, without having done serious exercises or studied spiritual science, this does not mean that they are more advanced than everyone else. Okay, so Steiner actually has very good teachings on psychic ability. They're often not framed in like the catchy develop your intuition, psychic powers, but they're there nonetheless. The techniques and the wisdom is there nonetheless in the anthroposophical system. So um, Steiner sort of talks about different kinds of intuition. And there's imaginative, intuitive intuition, and these are like different, pretty much different. They're associated with different levels of spiritual clarity that the individual can develop. So basically, there's certain kinds of clairvoyance that you can have that is almost sometimes people think something is clairvoyance, but it's really just associations. So you see one thing and your mind will automatically associate it with someone else, with something else, but there really is no spiritual meaning to it necessarily. So that's a kind of false clairvoyance because it's just your brain in pictures associating things. The pictures in your body are just coming up through association, kind of like synesthesia or something like that. And people will think that that's clairvoyance, but in reality, it's just the pictures in their mind jumping around due to associations it's making. And there isn't anything really spiritual within the individual for those things to anchor and center around, right? So the idea is you have to have some regimented study, and you have to have a certain force activated within you in order for your intuition to operate through a higher power. And so there's also certain abilities that you can carry over from past lives. So this happens a lot, actually, is that people will be very easy in natural clairvoyance. But if you don't understand occult science, like you don't understand and you can't actually explain how your psychic abilities work in detail, how the spiritual world works in detail, then you're kind of open to lower forces, to be honest. And this happens a lot with mystics, is that there is the ability, there is the power, but there isn't the ability to explain how it operates within them, within themselves. There isn't the ability necessarily to describe the spiritual world in an objective way. And so in spiritual science, it's considered imperative that you're able to do that, lest you be used by lower forces. So that would be my opinion on that would be my opinion on that without having read the whole lecture. But you can have certain forms of vision, right? And it's not necessarily cured with the Christ impulse, right? It's not necessarily attuned with the highest possible forces. So attunement is incredibly important. And I think to really, with the faculties we have today, which is a very intense mind, we have incredibly developed mind at this point. I think that the highlighting of the academic level of spiritual science and understanding certain exercises and studies, I think that is keeping people, it keeps you safe, because when you understand the process that you're engaging in, you're going to be a lot better at it, right? Like I've heard some mystics say, I don't research anything, I don't read anything, I just allow them to speak through. That's a really bad strategy, because you can't even explain, why or how it operates. You're going to become a prime vehicle for dark forces because you don't understand your process. So for psychic development today, for spiritual development today, we have to understand. We are intellectual beings, right? So we have to understand, which is why, the age of Aquarius and, the new era of humanity is all about objectively understanding the spiritual world, getting away from superstition, getting away from superstitions, getting away from the idea of having to follow an oracle, right? It's that every person should be able to understand the spiritual world and the spiritual realities of their being through spiritual science, which is an objective science, just like natural science. So that's the shift. All right, this next question is from a member again. I am an artist and for the past few years have been making Black abstract paintings. I feel they convey a sense of the deep mysteries of the cosmos and the divine feminine. Lately, though, some people have interpreted them as something dark. My intention is to send out positive energy with my work. Is using the color Black, quote, out of time for conveying a positive message in the current masculine Mars times we are living in? Great question. So I have to say that in the last 10 years, I have seen an increase in occult knowledge and interest, which is wonderful. I love to see that. I remember a time 20 years ago where if you talked about anything, like if you talked about like an angel or something or anything psychic, like you would get so made fun of. You wouldn't dare go on the internet and talk about it or do anything, like you were a total weirdo. That's how it was 20 years ago, even 15 years ago. Today, you can talk about it and it's popular and it's becoming more and more mainstream, which is actually great. It's good that that's happening because it was much too repressed and suppressed before. But I've also seen with this a lot of superstition. And it's kind of like so much of people's interest in the occult has come through, I think, the conspiracy oriented vein of the political right. Not, but there's also some darker things going on the left too. But I think when it comes to fearing the feminine, not understanding the feminine essence, I think that comes more so from the political right, unfortunately. It does actually comes from the left too, but ultimately, it's this sort of superstition that's really destructive. It's if you see a triangle, this is the Illuminati. If somebody has like an owl, that is Bohemian Grove. If somebody is painting using the color Black, then they're like demonic. This is superstition. And I see so much superstition to bizarre proportions, like I just mentioned, but also lesser degrees of superstition where, this is not, it's not coming from an understanding. It's coming from a fear of darkness, a fear of evil. And so a rejection, therefore, of anything that person thinks might be, that's not a measured understanding of the phenomenon, that's superstition. And that doesn't help anyone, including the individual that is superstitious. So the feminine is associated with the color Black. It comes into mind the very, very, very ancient and pretty much forgotten mysteries of Venus and Black Sun. Black Sun has nothing to do originally with certain small mustache people. It actually has to do with the feminine mysteries, which is why I also went so hard against that in Mars Mysteries, is because to be able to talk about the feminine mysteries, you have to clear out so much bizarre, weird stuff that has attached themselves to the symbols of the feminine mysteries, like the moon. The weird stuff that happens with the moon is so bizarre. And the color Black Sun, I mean, it's just so distorted and weird. It's hard to have a conversation about any divine feminine rights and the matriarchal age, because the symbology is just, it's like it's shredded. It's just, it's just so damaged. You're just walking into it, you're like, oh my God, like it's what happened. So the color Black is not an evil thing. It is actually a feminine color, believe it or not, because it's associated with Black Sun, which is the deep mysteries of Persephone and Inanna, and the ability for the feminine to go into the void, the blackness of the void, and a sort of tradition that exists within the Venusian sphere about that, but also the various different offshoots of that that were to do with the Vestal Virgins and all the different Melissae and the different kinds of priestesses that retained a piece of that. This is why you'll see the statues of Mother Mary and her face is painted black. That is the Black Sun. That is from the matriarchal age. Those were carried over in secret sects that were not dogmatic. And so, no, the color black is not an evil color. What makes something evil is the nature of the essence behind it. So it is true that something that's coming from the eighth sphere will appear as dark, as black, right? But that is because of, well, really the feminine stands at the precipice, at the veil of that. It is true that that happens, and that's why things get kind of inverted. But you can't say entirely that the color black is evil. That's ridiculous. There's no color that's evil. The color red isn't evil, even though black and red is often used in the lowest of the satanic rites because it represents the lowest spectrum of the spiritual system, black and red. But you can't say that black is evil or red is evil. But you can say that there are certain symbols, certain colors that are used more often in satanic rites. That's just a reality. There's certain things that tend to not even be near that. But again, that's not saying that the entire nature of that thing is dark. Does that make sense? And yeah, a lot of the system is just becoming more and more entrenched in the Mars impulse, the fallen Mars impulse. And we really got to watch that for the next 4 to 5 years. If I look at the political system, you can look at the political left, which is sort of, if looking at the shadow aspects only, it really represents the fallen feminine impulse and Lemuria and the fallen Venus impulse, right? And then when you look at the political right, you see the fallen Atlantean impulse, the fallen Mars impulse, and all those astral impulses playing there. And you can really see that for the last, I would say, at least 4 years or so, we've been directly dealing with the Lemurian wounds that we had, which is, Lemuria was when the genders divided, when the sexes divided. And so we see all this pain and trauma around gender and sexuality coming forward. Well, that's a Lemurian wound. That's literally when you had an androgynous form that split into a male and female form. And so if there's any wounds in the soul, they're going to come out through that period. Also, the left tends to want to recreate a matriarchal existence. That's also Lemuria. That's the political left. It's about communism, communalism, tribalism. That is really a huge part of that. Now, there's tribalism on both sides, of course, but there's something about that communal nature that was really part of the matriarchy. If they had their way, they'd probably return it to a matriarchy. Then on the political left, you have the opposite of that. You have a repeat of Atlantis now, right? And you have this influx of, we're going to see an influx of technology that's going to be the same level of degeneracy that people were making fun of in the left, right? So we're going to go through a period that is, I would say we're kind of passing through the pillars of 2 old civilizations that we've already been through. The whole point is that we make better decisions and that we actually see what's going on. So during the Atlantean period, it was more of a masculine period. Part of it was ruled by Mars. And so we will confront with the political right the issues that we confronted in Mars, a lot of which I point out has to do with the misuse of technology and technology to control, but also deals with the destruction of the feminine. And which you see kind of in the red pill community, actually, or the manosphere, which is not understanding the feminine impulse at all. So we're seeing these 2 prior civilizations, Lemuria on the left and Atlantis on the right, kind of starting to rear their heads, I would say. And we have to make it through this as really an initiation for humanity, I would say. Okay. This next one is from Space Hippie Girl. Hey, Space Hippie Girl. In your contact protocol reading, you shared how your awakening began when you started meditating. You mentioned at some point through the experience of connecting with your guides, you came to the realization, if I recall correctly, that they were you from the future coming around to help you in this life. Is it hard for many souls to not have beings outside of them as guides? Is it hard for many souls to not have beings outside of them as guides? Yeah, so one of the strangest spiritual experiences I had was really the first spiritual experience that I had when I was actually looking back into Atlantis and thought it was another planet because it was just so different than anything that I'd known. And I did experience the most bizarre thing, which is I ended up seeing myself and communicating with myself, actually. And it was so futuristic that I thought it was alien. And I got caught up in the whole New Age movement because my experiences were not able to be explained through traditional spirituality or traditional religion. And so I ended up, yeah, I saw myself in another life, and I was able to communicate with myself in that life briefly, and it was very bizarre. I looked very similar, but a little bit different. And I saw basically all kinds of things to do with Lemuria and Atlantis and these different lives that I had had. And I would say the first 10 years of my awakening was trying to understand what I was seeing and why, with obviously no knowledge of that. I was raised atheist, actually. There was no spirituality in my home, was for weak people. That was like, I'm from the north, very, very hardcore, I would say Viking style, like, don't be emotional. Spirituality is for weenies, grin and bear it, be tough. Which I'm grateful for my upbringing for sure. There was a lot of things in there that were good, but on the spiritual side, I was completely unprepared and lost when I began to come into my abilities when I got older, which I think was also important because I think I'm actually very grateful because I came in pure. I came in not knowing anything. I didn't have any system that I was trying to fit it in. I just was like, whoa, wow. And so I think that was actually perfect. I wouldn't do it any other way. I'm grateful. But I ended up getting caught up in a lot of weird ideologies as I tried to figure it out. And so, yes, I did have an experience where I saw Lemuria, I saw Atlantis, I saw incarnations on different spheres. I saw Venus a lot. I saw Mars. And obviously, years later, a decade or so later, I would make Mars mysteries, and I have Venus mysteries coming soon. And I can see now, that everything happened exactly as it was meant to be. But if you want to have like some semblance of control of your like your reality in your mind, like no, no. So I can definitely see how all those experiences were exactly what I needed. Every vision, every visitation was all bang on, and it was me. It was me that like just had no idea. Was trying to understand. And so yeah, I've saved all of my old videos and all my stuff, and I go back and watch it. It's fun. It's pretty crazy to look back and see, I think, how far I've come in my understanding of spirit and even myself. So it's very humbling. It's very humbling, I would say. Okay, this is from I want to make sure I just didn't like talk about myself for that question. Let me let me see if I'm answering what you asked. I think that the last part of your question, is it hard for many souls to not have beings outside of them as guides? It's weird. You know how in psychology, and I even do this and it actually does work. If there's a part of you that needs parenting, so like if you're going through like this incredible grief or trauma and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm devastated, um, you become that parental figure that you never had, or you become that friend that you never had. You become that person that you never had in that moment to fulfill that deficit that you feel. You have to become that, because really your subconscious mind and your spirit doesn't really know the difference between whether you're loving yourself necessarily or whether it's coming from someone else. You just have to experience the love and experience the healing, the correct force. And so when you create that force within you, that loving presence, I think that if you were to look at it astrally, you would see basically you going back and comforting yourself as a child, or you in a future incarnation, coming in to yourself technically in the past, because it's lesser developed technically, because we're using developmental time here, not linear time. In spirituality, the best thing to do is to use developmental time, not like linear time necessarily, because that's how angels and astral beings primarily function, is through large cycles and really whether or not you're developed to a certain degree. So if you were to look at that, you'd probably see yourself as like an angel, really. If time is removed, that could be happening on some occasions, as literally a connection with you in a different time. It's very possible, right? I don't think it's kind of a weird thing to think about, but it's very possible. And then you also have spirit guides that are angels. You have, you know, adepts and masters around. We're so helped. It's crazy. We feel absolutely alone sometimes. But if you could see the amount of help that you have around you that just is waiting to be prayed to be let in, like you would cry, you would weep at the level of love that you have for you, pure divine love that angels have for you, that masters have for you. You would weep at the love, the purity that they have for you, and that you just have to let them in your life through prayer by asking. We're never alone. Aloneness is something that we create in our life because we don't acknowledge the spiritual planes. Okay, this is a member question. I was a member of a mystical school. One of the tenets of the school was the idea of holy perfection, the idea that everything in every moment is perfect. This seems to presuppose the notion of evil as something that actually exists. What are your thoughts? Also, is my blood being etherized anytime I'm consciously feeling Christ in my heart? Yes, it is the impulse of Christ, which exists in every single human being within their heart center. So obviously, there's Jesus, and Jesus is the master, the human master initiate that bore the Christ being for 3 years in his body and performed the rite of resurrection and crucifixion. But the being that is Christ is within now all of our heart centers as a transformational power that we can directly connect with to create an evolution in his image. And that's how initiation has always worked, is that you're always working with a being that is beyond you. And those skills and talents and information and all that energy is passed down to you from another being. It's not like, it's like the Gnostic thing where it's like, I just have to know, I just have to have all the wisdom, and then I'll be a master. And it's like, no, actually, this gets into the idea of spiritual economy, which is you actually have to attune yourself to a higher being that has already achieved what you're looking to achieve, and that's called initiation. And these are spiritual beings like angels, spiritual masters that work in a system to raise you into a higher station. That's how it's always been. Like the Bodhisattva, the Buddha, the Christ bearer. This is all a system of initiation. So you can't truly evolve just by like, just knowledge alone. You have to attune yourself to the Christ impulse within you. And when that happens, it's like sunshine on a seed. It's like the sun bearing down on a seed and giving it all of its life, because the Christ being is the sun. It is the highest solar spirit. It has that effect on us. So how we explain that, especially in anthroposophy, is through the understanding of the etherization of the blood. And when you hold the essence of Christ in the furnace that your heart is, it actually transubstantiates your form. Okay, so having Christ within your heart center, the acknowledgement of that actually transubstantiates your form into a higher body over time. That's called the etherization of the blood. That's where that leads. That it actually over time leads to a different form in which you can incarnate into, because you're changing the very substrate of your etheric body into something much higher, rather than not doing that. And then your etheric body does not become united with the heart center in Christ, but just repeats its kind of swirls around in intellectualism and the lower three chakras and lower impulses, and your etheric body just binds more and more so to the physical rather than rising out of it. That's the teaching of Christ within the heart center and etherization. I have a lecture on that, and more people have been speaking out about that. So check that out. And I just really want to hammer that home, that there is such a thing as attunement, right? In earlier periods, there wasn't really necessarily like a conscious attunement that you had to make, because you were sort of one with nature. But the moment we become an individual, we have to learn attunement, because we can either attune to higher things or lower things. The highest impulse in the cosmos is the Christ being, the macrocosmic Christ, the sun entity. So you have to attune to that, which is why there's those traditional biblical saying that says, you have to come through me. Well, that's an esoteric statement, right? So okay, and then the thing about a mystical school, one of the tenets of the school is the idea of holy perfection, the idea that everything in every moment is perfect. This seems to presuppose the notion of evil as something that actually exists. Evil exists. If you look at evil, there was a trend that was going on where the moment that someone would say that something was dark or evil, it was like this weird bypassing that would occur to make everything relative and to neutralize everything into relativity. Like, it doesn't matter. Everything in existence is just neutral. That's sort of a early consciousness before humanity fell. That's a pre-fall consciousness, when there was no dark and light, and it was sort of this Eden-like thing. That's not reality. We have darkness within us. Every single person on this earth, except for very few, have trauma, have pain, have darkness technically inside of them. In esoteric Christianity, this is called sin, right? That's all it is. And it's related to the moon, and it's related to karma in the Eastern tradition. So we have dark pain and karma, and that we have to learn to work through. We would call that evil sometimes. And we'd call the forces who only serve to destroy evil. A source that is out of control to the point that it is like the death impulse without any life would be considered evil. So there are forces that, if you attune with them, this is what we would call evil. If you attune with that force, and you follow that to its logical conclusion, you would be destroyed. That's really what evil is. If you were to just attune to that entity, like Lucifer or Ahriman or any kind of demonic entity that is imbalanced by nature, and you were to follow that progression, you would become destroyed. You'd become dominated by that entity and then eventually destroyed. So that's where the Christ impulse comes in, is Christ is really the middle path between the two impulses of evil, as Rudolf Steiner would say, the Luciferic impulse, which isn't really like the Luciferic impulse isn't really the definition of evil, actually, believe it or not. It's a confusion. It's an inversion. It's the wrong. It's a more like a misunderstanding, whereas the harmonic is much closer to Satan, actually. It's much closer to evil, the traditional idea of evil, I would say. But they both work together as two of the poles of evil, to just speak plainly, even though it's more complex than that, especially when it comes to Lucifer. Um, if you were to just align with Lucifer or Ahriman, they're imbalanced beings. They're not centered, right? They're not in evolution. They're outside evolution, technically. And they seek to draw humanity outside of evolution with them in their various different ways. So if you were to follow that, it would lead to the destruction of your soul. So that to me is evil. And that's really what evil and darkness is. It's an imbalance. So does it exist? Yeah. But, can you overcome it and transcend it? Absolutely. And you could argue that's why it exists. Okay. Paul Joseph Marchand. I love your passion for Christ. My question is this: dogma. I have heard this term word, yet don't understand it completely. I understand religions were formed from the Elohim, the seven spirits of the higher realms, and that matters of these religions occur, changes take place. Could you please expand on this? Thank you. Great question. So every single time a religion or spiritual tradition is formed, there really is a pure impulse. And so a lot of the times it's around a very high spiritual master. So Krishna or the Buddha or Jesus. And so you have this pure impulse that often comes through a great teacher, what in theosophy would be called a great teacher. And there's a high point often for that religion or spiritual tradition in which it is kind of more in its glory, where it's not really perverted and people are absorbing and it's healthy. It's kind of like the golden age of a system, or at least a more golden age of a system. But always, 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 because human beings are not like, we're imperfect, right? We end up taking a spiritual impulse, a pure spiritual concept that you can see is objectively true, right? Spiritually, and human beings will turn it into something that is in their image. And this is called dogmatism. So, in other words, there are pure spiritual concepts that are oftentimes a lesson. So, you have, the Buddha, right, who was the great preparer for Christ and was the great teacher of compassion and love and softness and unity, especially compared to later teachings, right? And then you have Christ, a bit more dualistic, a bit different. But you have a couple pure messages, and even certain systems. Like in Buddhism, there are specific systems that you can follow. And that evolves you to a certain point. But what ends up happening overall is that we end up reducing the pure spiritual impulse and intention of a master or of a spiritual movement, and we turn it into like our own shadow. We turn it into something dogmatic, which is a shell of what it really is. At this point in time, there is dogmatic Hinduism, there's dogmatic Buddhism, there's dogmatic Christianity. There is a dogmatic form of every single religion you can imagine. Now, there's also an esoteric form of every single religion you can imagine. the Theosophists did a wonderful job of bringing forward esoteric Buddhism, esoteric Hinduism. You could argue that Theosophy is based in that. And then Anthroposophy, and perhaps even later other kind of Western systems like Rosicrucianism are bringing forward esoteric Christianity. And so there's always this weird battle between the system that we create in the image of something holy and the holy thing itself. And you enter complete delusion when you start to think that the dogmatic version of something is the reality. You become trapped in your mind. In order to understand spirituality to any degree, you have to probably have some kind of transcendental experience with spirit, first of all. Otherwise, it's just a dogmatic mental construct that you're working through. Now, why that can be good is that if somebody is following a religion, like let's use dogmatic Christianity, for example, and you're following it, and obviously a big part of Christianity, as we discussed earlier, in the difference between Gnosticism, some kinds of Gnosticism and Christianity, is morals and love. So in Christianity, you have this importance of ethics, morals. There's the commandments. That was a complete shift from the pagan times, the Babylonian systems of earlier times, which were totally dark. Now you have ethics and morality arrive in a system which did not appear before Christianity in the massive way that it was. So ultimately, if you are within a dogmatic system, like dogmatic Christianity, and you understand, well, I should be moral, and when I am ethical, I live ethically, and I live morally, then I think that's going to prepare me to experience Christ within myself. That's technically correct. Even when you go into the most advanced esoteric systems, the first thing that you hear is, you will not get anywhere unless you can be moral and ethical. You will expose yourself to the darkest and weirdest forces imaginable if you cannot be of a certain moral character. So the highest levels of spirituality are only reserved for people who have compassion, who have love in their heart, which develops a system of morality. This is not about shaming people. You know, dogmatic Christianity uses too much shame. I think it's not loving enough. That's the criticism of it for a lot of people. And I would often agree with that. But even within the dogmatic system, there is this idea that it's good to be moral and that ethics is important. And that's actually very true. Because when we live from a place of compassion and love, which translates to morality and ethics, then we prepare our vehicle for Christ. So that is actually true. And if that can be retained, you will have a genuine experience with angels, with Christ, with higher forces, because you've been living in that way. So even though it came through a dogmatic system or a dogmatic belief, you were still doing the correct actions and living in a certain way that allowed a higher experience. The same thing with different dogmatic versions of Buddhism or whatever. The practices can still bring about a spiritual result, because there's something even in the dogmatic forms that can bring that in if the person is ready. Now, if someone is not ready, they'll experience that system as something completely dark and whatever sometimes. But there is, even in dogmatic traditions, there's often enough in there that if someone enters into it in earnest, they can connect. And a lot of people do. So it's not to say that there's no value in dogmatism, that people can't gather something from it. Even the knowledge of Christ or the knowledge of Buddha allows you to perceive those beings, right? So it's not to pick on dogmatism today or anything like that. But I think at the same time, we have to know that there is an objective spiritual world. There is a hierarchy of angels. There's hierarchies of elementals. You know, I mean, whether you want to believe in it or not, that's the reality. You have an astral body, you have an etheric body. You have a mental body. There are spiritual realities and many spiritual teachings that are not acknowledged in dogmatic Christianity. They just don't even talk about them because it's not meant to be for that time. It was not meant to address those things. You know, the same thing with Buddhism or very early traditions. They don't include Christ because they're before Christ. So you won't find in those ones, you won't find the real understanding of Christ incarnated in a human being because they're before that event. So every dogmatic tradition in existence today is missing a little bit of something. And it's only understanding occult science or spiritual science, I prefer anthroposophy, that we begin to see the higher reality in which all of these traditions were making themselves in the image of. Again, we have natural science of the natural world of the earth. There's also a science of the cosmos or a science of spirit. Okay, this next one is from Robert. How are you guys doing out there today? Okay, hope you have a cup of tea, a snack. We've still got a ways to go. And by the way, I have to say, I am live every other weekend on my private platform at gigiyoung.com. And I just do this. Whatever questions you guys have, we just sit down. Sometimes lately, for the past few months, we've been having so much fun that I'm there for we sit down for 4 hours and we just talk about whatever, current events, politics, the Elohim, Rudolph, Steiner, theosophy, religion, whatever you want, the dark entity that is plaguing you, angels. We talk about it all. And so if you like this, please support my work by signing up there. We also have forums, and there's an amazing community where there's professional mystics that are incredible, incredibly wise discussions going on there. And there's been so many times actually with the forum where there were important discussions going on that allowed certain things to be talked about that, weren't allowed on other platforms. So if you are interested in that, I'd love to see you over there, or sign up at least for my newsletter so you know when I'm going to do a public one of these again. Okay, this one is from Robert. Hello, Robert. And you said, can you offer advice on the best way to use breath to ground into your body and connect with our higher self and guides? More specifically, is nasal breathing, both to inhale and exhale, better than inhaling through the nose and exhaling through the mouth? Gratitude, as always. Yes. So in the Eastern traditions, there is an entire study of breath called pranayama, obviously, and that's where you get the alternate nose breathing, and you get a lot of discussion about the breath and prana. So it's a little bit different post Christ. This happens a lot. Is we have to acknowledge the sort of prior Christ system and the post Christ system. So now we don't get all of our prana or life force just through breath. Now we get at least half of it or a third of it through light itself. Rudolf Steiner talks about this in his lecture on yoga as well. But we're actually evolving in that capacity as well. So before we used to only get prana, as I understand it, mainly through breath, or it was mainly circulated through breath. But as we evolve, we start to get it more through light. So the way that we breathe is incredibly important, not just because it is how part of our prana is spread out in our body. And your prana is basically your life force or your chi, right? Your life force energy. It also has to do with the calming of the nervous system, and how you breathe can either create sometimes anxiety, like you're holding your breath, right? Or you're breathing very shallowly. That actually gets the nervous system to be on high alert, like you're in survival mode. And there's also the ability to calm the nervous system through deep belly breathing, and breathing in through the belly, the lower ribs, and then the higher chest. This is very typical in basic pranayama or in yoga. And so when you are breathing deeply, you relax, everything's circulated. And in very early periods in the Eastern mystery schools, it's like if you couldn't breathe properly, you weren't even considered for like higher tasks. So you really had to get these aspects of the body together um, in that earlier period. So generally, yes, the idea is to breathe through your nose. And I remember reading this really old book. It was from the 1800s of this individual who had gone over to India and had been studying pranayama and like recording all of the things that these great swamis were saying about breath. And he said, and you know, the books in the 1800s, they don't hold back. They can be a little abrupt. And they basically just said, they were like saying that like unattractive people breathe through the mouth and you have to breathe through the nose and you become like an animal if you breathe through the mouth. And they had like, apparently they had all these really intense teachings about like, do not breathe through your mouth. And it was really intense listening to it and reading it. And there was one where it was like, you know, the more civilized people become, the more they live in cities, the more they become mouth breathers. And the more people live in nature, the more the jaw forms and their nose breathers. It was a really fascinating, it's really fast. I can't remember what it is. It was a long time ago in which I read it, but it's your question, Robert, really reminded me of that, about how strictly the yogis believed in nose breathing unless it was some kind of activity like the breath of fire or something, or a certain activity. But yeah, you should be definitely breathing through your nose. You should also potentially tape your mouth shut at night, so that you're not breathing through your mouth. And a lot of this actually has to do with very practical earthly realities, that the mouth doesn't have the defense system that the nose does, and that the nose is designed to basically absorb microbes and bacterias and filter them where the mouth is not. So if you breathe through your mouth, you're basically allowing air in that's not purified the way that the nose does it. So there's all these different spiritual reasons, you know, disease reasons. So long story short, you guys, try to breathe through your mouth. I mean, your nose. Excuse me. I don't want the nose. Okay. Ryan, could we one day be the guardian angel of our pet when we evolve to the angel level and our pet evolves to the human level? I would like to make that goal. If so, thank you. So, what Ryan is talking about here is the reality that the primary way that we should be viewing the solar system is as a school. So it's really ultimately like, to view the solar system as like a bunch of rocks in the sky is kind of missing the point. Like, you're not really getting what the stars are and what the planets are, really, especially in regards to your real essence beyond the physical. So when humanity evolves beyond the earth and transubstantiates matter, essentially, and this will happen in different ways, like for different people, that's how I understand it. I'll lecture on resurrection and stuff a bit later. But when we get beyond the material earthly world, we go into something that Rudolf Steiner calls New Jupiter. New Jupiter is the cosmic or esoteric secret word for New Jerusalem. So in mystery schools, um, in order to really understand something, you had to understand the cosmic reality of it. So every piece of wisdom is actually held within the stars and the planets. The creation of certain planets, the destruction of them, and the stars, all of that is actually full of wisdom and is actually a certain kind of spiritual time, developmental time as well. And so in mystery schools, you'd have to know the cosmic version of evolution if you wanted to get to a certain level. So when Rudolf Steiner says New Jupiter, he's actually revealing something very important. because how you know it in Christianity would be New Jerusalem, right? So New Jupiter is the idea of New Jerusalem. And the temple isn't a temple on a mount or a physical temple. The temple is your body. It always has been referred that way. You know, that's what John calls it as well. So ultimately, humanity will evolve. And in New Jupiter, which is the cosmic language, the secret esoteric language for Jerusalem, is Jupiter. Then we will be at the level of angel. Okay? When we get to the level of Venus, we will be at the level of archangel. And when we get to Vulcan, we'll be at the level of archai. So the spiritual hierarchies are not just the hierarchies of angels, they also represent the human initiation structure. And there are certain deeds that must be done in order to reach each planetary phase of your own being. Okay? This is why I am so critical of the alien stuff, is because the alien stuff removes that. And that is what you need. You need the real esoteric teaching. You don't need to be thinking about all the weird spaceship stuff. We need to be talking about spiritual initiation and the planets, because that's what it always has been. So when you get to a certain, the reason why Ryan is asking this is because when you understand spiritual science, you do get to a certain point where you work upon the lower kingdoms of life. So, you know, when you become in different hierarchies, they work upon the mineral kingdom, then the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, and then the human kingdom. And so it's part of human evolution to eventually serve the kingdom beneath them, right? Now, this means that one day we will be the liberators of the lower kingdoms of life beneath us, like the animals, the plants, the minerals, right? We are to liberate the mineral kingdom in this existence. That's what transubstantiation is. That's part of resurrection, is actually liberating the elementals that are holding your being together. That's another esoteric secret of resurrection or ascension, is the reality that when we transubstantiate our physical form into a higher etheric astral body, the body of Jupiter or the body of New Jerusalem, right? The new temple is our body. We release the elementals that are in service and keeping our body operating. The elemental kingdoms are what keep our body together, just like everything else. So we liberate them through our own transubstantiation of our form. That's the sort of other aspect of resurrection, is that we actually liberate the mineral kingdom from having to substantiate our form for us. And they can go on and they can move into a higher form of life. That's why this teaching is so important. It's not just about us. Like, ooh, I'm building my Jupiter body. I'm building my resurrection body, the new temple, right? It's like, no, you're actually liberating part of the mineral kingdom and the elementals that are building your body. You liberate them through your love, through your right action, through your right thought, through your compassion, through living a holy life. You liberate all these lower forms that are holding you together, not lower and lesser, but lower in their evolutionary sense. We liberate the elementals, and they can then go on and they can move into a higher form of life. They can move into mineral existence and so on and so forth. So our transubstantiation eventually of matter, or our resurrection, if we can achieve it, liberates other beings as well. This is why we understand in esoteric Christianity, the incarnation of Christ in Jesus was the liberation of the human being. Well, we are liberating the mineral kingdom. We are liberating the earth as well. But that shows you how high Jesus and Christ were, in order to, through that incarnation, liberate humanity the way that we are liberating the lower kingdoms beneath us by our work. So this is the real teaching behind spiritual initiation, the elemental kingdom, the elemental world. It's not just like, oh, I have a gnome in my backyard, I drew an adorable picture of it. No, these are beings, right? And then there's also the angelic beings, the angels, some of which have been human, some on the earth, some have not in the same way. Okay, Sarah, can you explain a little about the continuity of consciousness? Why is it important, and is it something needed for this time? This is a great question. We were talking about, I think, continuity of consciousness last time, either on my private platform or here. And what continuity of consciousness is in Esoterica is the idea that when you go to sleep, basically, you no longer have kind of like when you go into the astral world, it's not as bizarre to you. You have just as much control over the astral kingdom or the astral world, or a certain amount of enmeshment with it, that it's more like a lucid dream rather than you go to sleep and it's like you don't remember anything, or you can't be an active participant in your dreams. And so when you are able to sort of dream more lucidly and operate from a place of will in your dream time, that is called continuity of consciousness. And eventually, it is said that when an initiate gets very, very developed, that there's no real difference between their dream time and their waking life, meaning that obviously they'll be in their astral body and their astral form, they'll be in a different condition, but there's a strong observational continuity where they're not like sort of victims of the dream state. And that's continuity of consciousness. That's typically what it's called in Esoterica. Obviously, that is a really big achievement, and some people dedicate a lot of their life to that. It starts with learning how to astral travel and lucid dream and become educated in the astral plane and the astral body and all of that. But it's important because the more you become aware of your dream time, the more you become aware of basically how you really feel and think. And you become aware of your subconscious mind and your subconscious processes. And that's important for your development, because when we're, how our consciousness is now is it's basically designed to endure. And so many people will just endure and endure, and keep going and keep going. And meanwhile, it's like just one trauma after another just piling on your back as you're like trying to push through, and the responsibilities. And you're just like, eventually you're just completely tied down by just survivalism. And that often will appear in your dreams. And so the purification of the soul, which means that's not a righteous thing. That's like dealing with your trauma, dealing with your darkness. The more your dreams become like a communion with the astral world. I don't think it means having like some perfect dream experience, but you just become, you can become so your dreams are a meaningful extension of your life, and they're not constantly communicating with you your fear, and you're driving in the car and there are no brakes, or you're showing up to school and you have no pants on. And like, the dreams tend to reveal your underlying stress, and they're supposed to do that, so you don't become too entrenched in matter. And they're supposed to convey that so that we work upon it, so the whole goal as a spiritual practice is to, first of all, remember your dreams. And a good way to do that is to have like a dream journal beside your bed, and to write as much of the dream as possible down when you wake up in the morning, or if you wake up at night. And if you cannot remember anything about the dream, you have to start with how the dream felt. So the atmosphere of the dream. And the more that you do that, the more that the dreams will become easier to understand. Then once you do that, you can also practice some astral travel, lucid dreaming techniques that allow you to start becoming aware in your dreams. And that can help too. So there's whole processes that mainly have to do with understanding the astral body, the astral world, understanding lucid dreaming, astral travel, understanding the subconscious mind. All of those things are part of the dream teachings, the dream world. Okay. Hannah, can you describe life on other spheres? I'm very interested in learning about the life wave on other planets. Okay. The Aquarian age, which we are moving into, is about the cosmos. And it's about understanding ourselves and the world in terms of the cosmos, of the planets. And that's why we see the popularity of science fiction. We see the cosmos entering spirituality. And we see a bunch of good stuff around this, but also a bunch of just very weird stuff. So the only way we can ever understand another sphere is through the personality and reality of our own sphere. There is no way to understand Venus objectively. There is no way to really understand any planet in its complete objective form. We can only understand any planetary sphere based upon our own. And that's really important because one of the trends is this idea that you can objectively know things that we really can't. We can only really know another planetary sphere based on the Earth because we are incarnated into an earthly body, which means we are incarnated into a certain perspective, and everything that we experience will be from the earthly perspective. And there's certain life on certain planetary spheres is parallel to our own in certain ways, and we can't actually access certain levels of life on other planets because it's out of our spectrum. So in other words, when we look at other planets, it's really a matter of spectrums. It's kind of like how we only see a small spectrum of like light, right? We don't see radio waves and microwaves. We only see a small perspective. That's like the cosmos, actually. And so everything that we can perceive is related somehow to us, including exoplanets and stars. However, all planets outside of our solar system and all stars outside of our own star are most appropriately communicated already through our stars and our planets, if that makes sense. So that has to do with how the planets are created and when. They're all created in a certain sequence and they dissolve in a certain sequence. The same thing with stars. And these are really actually great beings. Okay. So for example, if we were to look at life on Venus relative to us, we would see very advanced angels, basically what we would consider angels. You would see people with the ability to basically resurrect, and they don't die like we normally do. They are preparing for a completely different spiritual existence. They are going through their own connection with the Christ impulse in different ways. The Christ impulse initiates every planet in its own way, according to that planet's expression. Mars is very interesting because Mars is not a particularly exalted sphere. It does have a transcended, exalted nature, but because everything is viewed through Earth and Earth time and Earth consciousness, we can't see the completion of Mars. We can only see Mars in relation to ourselves and our relationship with it, where we are. And so Mars is technically behind earthly development. And on Mars, they're still humans. Like, this is the thing, is that the human form is the form of the cosmos, because the human form is basically the microcosm of the macrocosm. It is. That's why the human form is completely divine. So when you start seeing all these beings that are apparently like positive aliens that don't have a human form, there's like an animal head on it or something. I mean, I don't know what that is, but that's not an angelic force. I'm sorry. The human form is the microcosm of the macrocosm. The human form is existing in different states and conditions on every planet in the solar system, from very rudimentary astral forms on spheres that we can't even see right now, to the most dense form, which is the Earth, which we have. But it's all human. It's all different stages of human development. Now, are there different kinds of life or something that could be, actually, if you were to ask the Theosophists, they would actually say no. One of the most incredible things about that I read from Blavatsky, actually, or that I really like, because it shows how crazy I think things have gotten now, is that everything in existence will either become human, or is human, or was human. So everything in existence will either become human, is human like us, or was human. And that gives you a real sense of what the cosmos is, as being based in the evolution of the planet and human beings. So that is the real deep esoteric reality. Everything is either going to become human. So now you're looking at the elemental kingdoms, the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom, right? The mineral kingdom. Eventually, not in this cycle, but eventually they will become human. Technically in a different embodiment of the earth. There are beings that are human like us. And then if you're looking at an angel, at one time, that angelic being was human within their planetary sphere. So the esoteric science behind human initiation and evolution is very tight. There's a lot of potential, there's a lot of growth, but when you look at a different planet, you're looking at a human planet where the human beings have a different level of initiation, or they're at a different level of development. Whether it be technically behind where we are, which means, like in the case of Mars and some other planets, they do not have the level of, I would say, integration that is available on Earth. They're missing things, right? So that is very, very important to understand. And if you can hold that in your mind, that everything will either become human, is human, or has been human. If you can understand that, it will cut out so much noise and so much weird stuff that is literally to make inhuman things and inhuman teachings and dark things popular, right? The human being is the microcosm of the macro. It is literally the embodiment of the universe, of the cosmos, and of the sun. That's what we are. Every organ, everything about us. And the planets, again, are different stages of the human form evolving over developmental time. They're different initiatory steps. That's the real secret of the cosmos. That's the real teaching of initiation. That's it. Okay. This one is from the Sunbeamer. Could ceremonial magic be used to channel spirits of the sun? Okay, so ceremonial magic is basically invoking certain forces to sort of harmonize with them, in the darker sense, to get them to do your bidding. But ceremonial magic does not always, it's not black magic or anything like that. It's literally just harmonizing with certain forces. There's ceremonial magic in every religion, actually. So yeah, you can do different activities to harmonize with the spirits of the sun, they're already within you. This is the amazing thing about the post-Christ period, is that all those forces are already within you. So just through acknowledging it, just through prayer, you don't have to do like a big ceremonial thing unless you want to, unless it helps you connect, unless you just really enjoy it. But it's already within you. The kingdom of heaven is already within. So these solar spirits are already within you. That essence is already within you. You know, the Elohim are within your being, the great sun spirits. You know, that's how we would say it in earlier periods, but we would also say the Christ impulse, right? That's all within you. So you just have to bring attention and focus to that and build it up within you through prayer and meditation. If you really want to do some kind of ceremonial celebration of that, that's lovely, that's wonderful. But we have to know that it's not necessary to do that to connect, because it's already within us. All right, this is from Valerie. Is there a way we can psychically protect ourselves from voice to skull technologies? Or is that wishful thinking? You know, yeah, you definitely could. It's sort of like, you know, you make fun of people in tinfoil hats, or like wanting to turn their house into a Faraday cage. And in reality, there's actually kind of some truth to that. Like, I do think that if this is a certain synthetic signal, that you probably could put a device around your head or in your home that would technically block that signal from coming in. I have not personally looked into that. It's probably going to be some variation of like a Faraday cage. And there are certain devices that you can obviously use. Trees. I mean, trees and just living in nature, moving water is also very good for that. The living in city centers where there is no trees, where there is concrete and electrical wires, and there's not a lot of nature, it's a lot easier to, I think, have these frequencies around. Not that you have to freak out if you're living in a city or anything, but there are certain environments that are naturally fight that off, which are wooded areas, obviously, moving water. But you can also set up your home in certain ways where there aren't a lot of electrical fields, where you can have a Faraday cage or something. So it's not impossible, but I haven't researched it to the point where I would be able to advise on that. But I'm glad that you mentioned the voice to skull tech, because I feel like in the future, not even in a decade, I don't think, but like later probably, I think it's very likely that we're going to find that either through satellites or certain devices that there have been basically voice to skull things going on, where, for those of you who don't know, voice to skull is basically a device that was created like in the 60s or 70s. Like, imagine what the technology is today. Like, if they had voice to skull, which is basically the ability to have this like blowhorn thing, make it so people hear voices in their head. Like, you hear someone talking in your brain. Okay. If they had that in the 60s and 70s and they actually came out with it, imagine what they have now. And imagine what they had then, that they released the papers that they even had that. So we're looking at probably significantly more sophisticated technologies that can put messages in people's heads, that can change how they're thinking, create brain fog, affect people's dreams. It's a really dark reality, but you have to say at some point, like, if the technology exists and if there are immoral people on the planet, you can't write it off. It's not smart to write it off. So I think that eventually we'll find out, as more and more corruption gets pulled down, which I think is going to happen. I think we're going to find out that there were satellites or certain antennas that were literally broadcasting either actual psychic messages to people, Like people think that they're communicating with a spirit, right? And it's literally just a satellite, or it's some kind of antenna somewhere that's literally just emitting a certain spiritual teaching. And people think that they're having this like psychic contact experience or whatever, and it's literally just a voice to skull technology that's beaming out the false origin story or certain teachings that are false light teachings. I would not be surprised at all to find that that's another shadow side of this massive push for technology, is hyper sophisticated voice to skull stuff that is being broadcast. I'm sure there's probably like TV shows on this as well, but yeah, no, I definitely think that, why wouldn't it be? I mean, a lot of people feel like they're having these experiences, and we know even that certain beings can be alive in electricity and certain waves and stuff like that. So I think that there is a merging of sort of dark propaganda, really demonic propaganda that comes through technology with a bunch of false teachings and things. That wouldn't surprise me. That wouldn't surprise me at all. And there's probably more intense ways. Maybe you guys can share that in the comment section on how to like make it so your home is not. I mean, we just really have to start to grow up and seriously confront the corruption that exists. And I think that when we can actually begin to do that, we will be shocked at the different ways in which certain people and forces try to control us and keep us down. That being one of them. Okay, this next one is from a member. How does one maintain a penitent and solemn heart when being actively triggered to maintain a state of anger and fear, or TI experience? What is the difference between surrender and taking action to face your fears? How can we know what to do when we have taken a long time to make a decision and have actively been confused by dark powers? This is a great question. I love this question because, in my own life and with different people that I've spoken to, from different comments that I've seen on other people's material and my own, it seems like people are experiencing what they feel like are psychic attacks, being weighed down, almost like there's just this darkness that's leaning on them. And it just sort of feels like almost like an unfair level of oppression sometimes from low emotional states. But really, for those who are esoterically inclined, of course, you can see the beings behind these things. We can see the beings that live in anxiety, the beings that live in depression, and you can sense the esoteric underpinnings of it. And so I've been noticing people feeling like they just can't catch a break. And I want to acknowledge that, because I feel like, you don't have to think that you're alone, It's important to know that I feel like these are collective experiences. And when that happens, when you feel like there's just like this intense weight on you, everything comes in rhythms and everything comes in phases. And so this is like productive advice, like just grounded advice, is you have to make yourself a schedule of what you have to do that day, what you need to achieve. So this means everything from the mundane, like, do you have to get groceries? Do you have to go get something dry cleaned? Do you have to go visit with someone? What responsibilities do you have in order to exist? You write all those down for that day. What work do you have to do? And then you also write in a few things that are going to bring you joy. And no matter what sort of darkness comes down on your heart, no matter how depressed you feel, no matter how anxious you feel, you do what's on the list. And you'll find that by doing what you have written for yourself, you actually, in a sense, overcome a lot of the darkness. It's funny how that happens. And so when it comes to being weighed down by anxiety and depression and even dark spiritual forces that may be cast out into the world because of the period that we're in, it really helps to have routine. It really, really helps to have a routine. Now, you don't want to make your list something that you just know you can't achieve, because you're just going to feel like you're a big failure and you're going to get more depressed, and that's not good. So you want to make sure that it's something achievable. And what will end up happening is, if you can do this, you'll still be productive, so you won't be compounding depression and anxiety. But at the same time, you'll sort of confront and prove to yourself that no matter how much darkness you feel is coming upon your heart, that you can still break through. And it's that rapport with yourself that's very important. And what you do psychologically and spiritually is that when things get really, because you said anger and fear here, so we'll use that. When you just feel like you're in so much anger and fear, you want to deactivate the mind, right? So when you go so much into anxiety and anger and fear, what you want to do is you want to go into the heart, you want to open your heart, okay? And you want to call on God, you want to call on Christ, and your time becomes about prayer. So whatever time you have, you want to pray that Christ enters your heart, that he heals your heart, that you go into prayer for Christ to enter your heart. Okay? And so that becomes more so a state of spiritual receptivity for you, where you say, you know what? Let the world go right now. Let the mind go because it's triggered. And you just open yourself to the forces of Christ, of angels, of the higher world that is there for us. And that is where you operate. So you just operate from a place of your heart being completely open to love and to Christ within you. And you don't even use your mind. You just carry out your day saying your mantras of prayer. And that is really how I often get through it, is that when things are really, really dark, I just open up to prayer. And I pray and I pray and I pray and I pray. And that can change your state. That can eventually change your state of being. It doesn't necessarily always go away immediately, but what it does is it gives you grace, I would say. It's normal to be depressed. It's normal to be anxious. It's normal to feel badly. And you shouldn't hide from that. You shouldn't run from that. You should listen to yourself. You should listen to why it's there. You should integrate that. And there's many teachings on that. But you also have to, it also really helps to add that attunement with angels and Christ and God during these times, because that is that light that counters that darkness. Okay, this one is from Freya. What would you call the gods and goddesses of old mythologies? Are they angels? Are they a special kind of spiritual being? Ooh, very similar to an earlier one that we did. So I would say some of them are angels. Like when you look at like Apollo or some of the sun gods, that's very clearly like a solar angel. But then some of the beings were probably, I would say, a kind of representation of your collective consciousness that comes into being through the elemental world. And technically it is an astral entity, but it's not necessarily the same thing as an angel. It's more representative of a mixture of humanity and the angels, or humanity and the animal kingdom and something higher. So some of the gods you see they're not representing necessarily like an angel, but humanity's relationship with the higher world, a certain quality, really. So that's what I would say there. It's a mixture of different things. Okay, Amelia. Do other physical sentient beings here on Earth walk through the veil of forgetting, like dolphins, whales, elephants, or do they know who and what they are here for? Is there a negative version of them? Thank you. Okay, so this is about the animal kingdom, and the animal kingdom operate in like a group soul. So only when life evolves into the human kingdom do we get the individual soul or the ego or an anthroposophy, the I. So it's the human kingdom where you individuate from what's called the animal level of consciousness and into an actual sovereign human being that can create and evolve via their own volition and free will. So the animal kingdom is not like a lower kingdom, like lesser in its value, but it is a lower consciousness because it does not individuate to have an I, right? And even beneath that is the plant kingdom, which is sentient, but it doesn't have the level of awareness that like the animal kingdom has. So the animal kingdom, which is every single animal, operates in a group soul, and it operates in a kind of collectivity, right? And they don't really fall like human beings do. They don't have the potential for, I think, maliciousness to the same degree that human beings do. But they have their own kinds of experiences within their own classification. And there are certain animals that tend to be thought of as being closer to moving forward into the human kingdom, and then there's animals that are typically more primitive in their nature. That even within the spectrum of the animal kingdom, there's certain animals like dogs and cats and elephants and probably dolphins that are um, more evolved in their consciousness than other animals. And it's not that they're better; it's just that there's more integration. So even within every kingdom of life, whether it be human, whether it be animal, whether it be plant, there's even variety in there of development. Yet it's kind of hard to understand because it's not in the same way as we humans are. It's very challenging to enter into other kingdoms of life and speak with authority on it. Like the same thing when we go into the celestial kingdoms of angels. It's like, describe the life of an angel. It's like, you can't really, because you can only describe the life of an angel relative to us, relative to being a human. So there's certain things that, because of our own nature and our own existence, we can't fully grasp. And to speak about it would be to profane it. So certain things just aren't spoken about because you want to maintain. In certain cases, the maintenance of the mystery is better psychologically than to profane the topic, which is always something that if you're a teacher, you always have to be considering. Like sometimes revealing as a secret or an esoteric thing, it can be true, but it may not be able to be received. So that is often the case with different kingdoms of life or things that are so far away from our own existence that it's very difficult to understand. Okay. This one is from Christina Cooney. How to avoid black magic when it's trying to manifest. Thanks. Yes. So there's a bunch of things. There's so many things we can get into. We should probably do like a talk about this. But ultimately, the one key that you have to understand is that no matter the power of a dark magician or a demonic entity or like a demonic force, no matter their power personally, they can only really affect you to the degree in which you are ignorant to yourself or the degree to which you are fearful. And they can only really resonate forth a completely augmented state that already exists within you. So this is why, you know, in spiritual science, we really focus on spiritual evolution, And eventually human beings will evolve to the point where black magic isn't possible. It doesn't affect us and it doesn't exist in the same way it does now. Because human beings that are on the higher path will eventually evolve into such a self-succinct system within their bodies that they will not be subject to lower forces as much. This is later in the future. It'll sort of take on a bit of a different darkness, and evil will take on a different shape in future planetary incarnations. So it's good to understand that as well. Where we are now is kind of the thick of it, really, for, you know, the mixing of dark and light. We're really in the thick of it. And actually, doing really grounded things, the times in which like a psychic attack will affect you the most is if you're in your head a lot. The more physical you are, that you're hiking, you're doing something, you're cleaning, you're going out, you're moving around, the less those things tend to affect you, and then they kind of run their course. Now, you want to be very careful, obviously, with everything that you're doing. You want to be very conscious and aware. But the more active you are, the more grounded you are, the better it is for that. The more you sort of, if you're thinking about, if you're in your head too much, that's where you tend to be more vulnerable to any influences that are sent towards you. So you really want to have, like I said earlier, a good, strong routine. You want to do things that you love. If you feel like you're under a dark cloud, you want to do things that you love. That really helps as well. But you don't be too much in your head, though. Don't think about it too much. Don't obsess about it, because when you're too much in your head, that's when things tend to get worse and worse. You want to be in your body, busy doing things, grounded. That's the best advice that I could give right now. But I do plan on doing a whole thing on psychic protection and all this sort of stuff in the future. Okay, this one is from Gabriel Angel. Hey Gigi, my question is, what do you think about people channeling the Galactic Federation of Light? So, I did a lecture 2 weeks ago called The Dark Side of Disclosure, where I describe where the Galactic Federation originates from. So I understand that there may be people out there talking about like a galactic confederacy or a galactic federation, and that's fine. But where that idea comes from is actually Scientology. So in Scientology, and this is around 1940, L. Ron Hubbard is the first to really mention and bring into the public sphere the idea of like a confederacy of angels, of aliens. Before this, we had the spiritual hierarchies, and you had the understanding of the different kinds of angels, spiritual evolution, the elementals, and behind the physical world was this beautiful kingdom of elemental beings and angels of different kinds. And it was, I mean, I remember, in one theosophical book, I think it was Blavatsky, she says that there were so many different words for the different kinds of beings that were in the elemental kingdom and angelic kingdom, what people called them, that you could fill libraries with just the definitions of what people used to call the angels and the elementals and what they did. So we have this incredible rich history and these teachings, deep occult, real meaningful esoteric teachings about the spiritual hierarchies, about angels, about our own evolution, our own journey to become an angel one day. Masters, the Buddha. What is a Buddha? What is a Bodhisattva? What is a Christ bearer? We had all these beautiful teachings. And then around 1940, 1950, you start to see the spiritual hierarchies, which is a kind of organization, right? Being called like a confederation full of like space brothers and aliens. And you see the complete profaning of real, rich, and meaningful teachings about elementals and angels suddenly be absorbed and destroyed by weird alien teachings that get weirder and weirder and weirder as time passes. First, it starts with L. Ron Hubbard. He claims that he is the leader. He claims he's Lucifer, leading the galactic confederation of light, light being Lucifer, Lucifer being light, knowledge. And all of this weird stuff comes from that. Literally, 10 years later, Von Tassel and probably 5 or 6 other people connected with 3-letter agencies come out and say they're connecting with the Galactic Federation. And these Venusian beings are there. And so as time went on, the story just got weirder and weirder and weirder. And it went from beings that looked like basically angels in spacesuits that were parroting the reality of Eden and the angels from Venus. Suddenly that turns into a gray alien that basically molests you at night and takes your genetic information. And that we're supposed to evolve this way, right? And then it turns into basically chimera beings with like, human animal beings. Those have always been etheric imprints. There's always been basically beings from the 8th sphere that looked like part animal. Go back and look at any medieval text of a demonic entity, and you will find a chimera looking being that really is no different. Just now we put them in spacesuits and say they're on ships. The idea of a chimera being is nothing new. It's how we portrayed beings from the 8th sphere for thousands of years. It's not an alien. This is just not understanding the spiritual hierarchies and the elementals in the spiritual world at all. Then, first it was the Space Brothers that basically replaces the idea of spiritual masters, right? Then it turns into like Aleister Crowley's lamb entities, like gray entities that are, raping people and stuff, but also at the same time saving them. Like, it's a bizarre mindset. It's completely like abusive. Sorry, but just saying it like it is. And then you get this sort of puharic level entity that isn't alien. It's not really a physical at all. It's just this AI. It's this nebulous AI. That's just pure consciousness, pure spirit. It's our pure consciousness. It's our pure spirit. So in my personal opinion, based on my analysis, and quite frankly, being in this belief system for a long time, we literally see this idea of the Galactic Federation, Space Brothers, all this kind of stuff come from the angels of Venus, which were angelic beings and never physical, never flew in a ship. Like a spiritual master, a saint, is not going to arrive in your backyard in a ship. They just materialize here. And eventually, if you get to an exalted spiritual condition, you don't need to get into a ship and go anywhere either. You'll just spiritualize into a location. It's called bilocation. It's a well-established city in the Eastern traditions. You don't need technology for any of this, but that's what every single alien religion is the proponent of. It's always about the spiritual technology that's going to take you to Mars or take you to Tau Ceti or take you to Sirius. The spiritual ship that's going to transform your body into a spiritual body. It is a transhumanist joke that we have to wake up to. Spiritual beings do not need to use technology, and they don't use technology. People do. Yet in all of these alien religions that I see that get really hardcore about it, it's always about, we're going to bring forward all this technology to liberate you and get you into the next level of human development. The next level of human development is not space colonization, because the planet is going to spiritualize out of matter altogether. But I guess if you're a dark person or like a dark entity, you'll be trapped in the 8th sphere. So perhaps you'd have to, I don't know, something with that. But ultimately, what I'm trying to say is that, in my opinion, you see the complete degradation of real spiritual teachings in these alien teachings that go from like Space Brothers, which is a mockery of saints and masters, right? And then it turns into these gray aliens that abuse you, and they abuse animals, but it's for your own good because hybridization. And then it turns into basically like triangle head being and bizarre things that when I look at them, I'm like, this is to humiliate people. Like, nobody believes this. Like, this is to literally make this topic of cosmic spirituality, which, as I was saying, is closer to resurrection than anything else. It's literally to make it look stupid. It must be to make it look stupid. I mean, does anyone think that there's a triangle being? This is what Gaia was saying. And it's the most bizarre stuff that's not rooted in anything in real esoterica. And then it's just a signal that we receive from space that's pure consciousness, like spectra that Uri Geller was. This is where it goes. It's just the complete dehumanization of spirituality through making it so alien it turns into an AI signal. And that's where you get the transhumanism and the technological revolution and everything I've talked about. And I think it's I think that ufology and the New Age is completely consumed by this, not knowing that there is an esoteric reason for any, like if something's interdimensional, it's just a different plane, right? Like if something is from another dimension, it's from another spirit, it's from the astral plane, right? So we're creating all this language. If something is if there's non-human intelligence, it's either an angelic being or a demonic entity, right? This comes from understanding the nature of the cosmos. So that's my opinion. I know people have their own opinions on it and they are welcome to it, but that's my take on that and where I think it's going to go. Okay, this one is from Max. Hey Gigi, when exactly in the scheme of cosmic development did Lucifer and Ahriman have their individual falls? How does Sorath tie into all of that? Also, what's your opinion on the debates as to whether Rudolf Steiner died of poisoning? Thank you. So, technically, I believe Lucifer fell as an angel within the Venusian line, which means astrally he was connected to Venus during the Lemurian epoch. So that's Eden, and that's where you get the Eden story from. Ahriman is different. In anthroposophy, Ahriman falls, I believe, during the old sun evolution. That the essence does. And but how I see it is there was also a sort of fall of the Harmonic angels led by the Harmonic impulse during Atlantis. So when we deal with occult science, we deal with recapitulations or what's called the law of recapitulation, which means that every single epoch, every single civilization within the epoch, there's a recapitulation of all of the phases of life that came before. And then it gets to a certain point where all those phases are recapitulated and something new occurs. And during that period, the form and consciousness changes, yada, yada, yada. So we do see a recapitulation of various different falls of cosmic beings that happened in prior developmental periods of the Earth, like the Saturn development, the Sun development, and the Moon development. So I think that a kind of legion of harmonic angels began falling in Atlantis. I think there was a recapitulation of that fall in 1879 per Rudolf Steiner, where he directly also associates them with Babylon and the moon as well, being in the Babylonian impulse. So there's actually, what I would say is there's actually a science to the periods where angels have fallen. And there's a science to the angels that have gone beyond their station into a higher station. So an angel turns into an archangel. An archangel will eventually rise through their deeds and sacrifices into an archai. So there's a whole astral dynamic of angels falling and even rising beyond their station. Some stay where they are. They don't rise nor fall. So there's a whole system of initiation within the celestial hierarchies, within the angelic hierarchies, that we are part of, right? Because the earth receives all that is like unclean. We receive the darkness, and the human being is to overcome it through integration, all the cosmic events through integration. Sorath is basically the black sun entity, the totally inverted god essence that is behind Ahriman, that is behind the Antichrist. People don't say too much about Sorath, or people don't even like to say the name of Sorath or Sorath, but it is mentioned in anthroposophy, and he does exist as basically like the anti-sun entity. He's an antichrist force. And so Sorath would be like this magnetic inverted force that would be, I think, tempting and calling the angels downward. I think that the Sorath force is like the anti-father. It's the anti-sun essence. And so if there's a Christ essence that draws us upward to evolve ourselves in the image of and nature of the beings in the Christ impulse and all of that, there's also an impulse of Antichrist, which is rooted in Sorath and is pulling everybody down at the same time. And then you see the fallen angels being within that influence, trapped within that influence, the same way that we're kind of trapped within matter. They're trapped within that influence. So they will behave as a system in support of Antichrist, basically, is how I see it. And Rudolf Steiner had a mysterious death, and he was at a Christmas party, I believe, and according to correspondences and I believe letters from I believe it was his wife, but also people there, he was having tea and he started to feel sick, and he realized that he felt that someone had put something in his tea. And he immediately left the party, and he had his stomach pumped, and went about trying to obviously cure himself from this drink that he'd felt was tainted. And he didn't pass right away, but my understanding is that he became bedridden and a lot of his body had shut down, and he was subsisting basically just from his astral body. I believe that's what he said. And he sort of tried to finish as much of the Michael mysteries and the Michael teachings that he could, because that's kind of what he was working on at the time. And he had so much work that he wanted to do, so he was kind of trying to close out his life. I think he knew he was going to pass. So that's my understanding. And what I can say, I won't speak for Rudolf Steiner. I don't have the authority to do that, or I won't do that. I can only speak my opinion. What I can say is that what Rudolf Steiner was doing was a major threat to a lot of secret societies at the time. There were certain secret societies that wanted to enforce a certain kind of political control and bring about certain systems that were very dark. And Rudolf Steiner saw this, and he began to directly counter this in his life. And so this is where you see the diversity of what Steiner brought forward, which is he starts to come up with Waldorf schools. Waldorf schools, in their original form, the Steiner schools, they were to be a spiritual science-based school that acknowledges how the human being evolves when the etheric body is fully developed and what the child is capable at the age of 1 to 7. Then from this age, the astral body develops, and the eye begins to come in. So this is what they're capable of. And he began to create that school system as an antithesis to the school systems that were developing, because he saw that as being a slave system. That's why Waldorf was created. It was supposed to be a healthy system. He goes on, he sees that agriculture is going to become horrifically awful and contaminated. He creates biodynamic gardening. He created systems and was establishing systems that directly counter the problems that we have today. He was not sitting in an attic somewhere, doing salons, reading, channeling people's dead relatives. There's nothing wrong with that. But this is a different kind of person who was trying to bring forth something much greater than himself in a practical way that had real implications on society. He was doing anthroposophical medicine, which included very advanced views of the physical body in relation to the astral body and the etheric body. And real, like, look at Dr. Cowan, who did a whole book about how the heart is not a pump. The heart isn't a pump. Okay, when you get into the anthroposophic aspect of medicine, that's an answer to the medical field. He comes up and says, look out for the vaccine in 1910. Okay, he does eurythmy. He develops a temple dance in which the motions of the etheric body can be seen. And on it goes, bringing forward the fifth gospel, bringing forward the Christ impulse, because theosophy had so badly misunderstood Christ, because the dogmatic version of Christ was not complete enough. This man was a threat to a lot of people because he was creating practical, meaningful, powerful spiritual systems that were not just airy-fairy, blah, blah, I'm just going to walk around my little maze for an hour and sit in my pyramid. No, he was doing real world systems that had a real effect. He was very grounded. He had a PhD. He was a scholar. He was a threat more than anyone else to certain groups because of what he was doing. They burnt down, someone burnt down his Gurdiotum. It didn't burn down itself. I'll leave it up for you to decide what happened to Rudolf Steiner. I won't speak for him at this point. So that's my thought there. But the reality is that, you know, the truth is the truth. And I think what he created was real. I think it was real vision. And I think that when something touches you and when something is that real, I think it's your responsibility to give credit to that and carry that on as much as possible into the world. I think that we have had great people who have walked this earth. And one of the most incredible things we can do is not just to focus on ourself and our message, or you and your message, but to carry something that's greater than you. To carry something forth that is of something greater than yourself, or carrying something on that's beyond you. It's not about you. And I think that's where the most beautiful teachings are, and the most beautiful, I think, teaching style is. And I think that's what Steiner's doing, and I think that that's what I would hope to do. So, yeah, I think he was a very real threat because he was creating very real practical systems that allowed people to be in harmony with nature, in harmony with their spirit, grow food properly. How many biodynamic wineries are there out there, and farms, medicine? He was really facing it head on. That's a threat. So, all right, this one is from Manny. Did anthroposophy abandon mediumship because of malevolent superintelligence from the eighth sphere? Is that part of the harmonic deception? Okay, so this is a good question, and we went into detail on my private platform a couple weeks ago on this, and it's a good question because it has to do with the evolution of the astral plane, and that, as I mentioned, the Earth sort of has an astral plane that surrounds it, that's sort of like a mental plane as well, and it consists of all of humanity's thoughts, emotions, and feelings. And then based on that, humanity draws certain entities into its experience, certain astral entities that can appear on Earth or appear in the etheric plane. And so in early humanity, say like in the Lemurian epoch, humanity was not really that fallen. They weren't that corrupted. And so human beings could just open up and they could connect with a, you know, spirit, basically a spiritual astral force, and it would always be basically positive in the beginning. But then the more that human beings became individuals, the more they individuated, the more they started to experience dark and light and contrast and evil within themselves, the more evil and the more darkness was also brought into the world. That's the quickest way to say it. So now where we are, it's not really possible as a medium to just open yourself up and just talk to whatever comes in. Again, there were times where it was more possible to do that, but you have to be really, really pure, and you have to be very, very attuned to be able to be psychic. You can, it's like the question that we did earlier when we were talking about Steiner again. He's talking about different kinds of clairvoyance, different kinds of psychic, tapping into psychic things. And it's like, you can be psychic and you can just tap into the demonic realm all day long. And they can lie to you and they can tell you, you know, you're just going to be famous and you're going to be so rich and we're just going to the money and the fame and the, you know, what they always tell you, and then some weird lies. And, you know, there's a whole experience you can have where you're just communicating psychically with demonic entities. And by the way, it happens when you're not even a psychic. It happens to people who become under the influence of occult forces, and they're just a normal person because they don't even realize they can tune into higher forces. They think it's their own thoughts. That's even more dangerous. People think being a psychic or medium is dangerous. I'll tell you what's dangerous: being ignorant of spiritual forces that surround you every day and not being able to discern them consciously and just being the plaything of whatever comes around, because that's sometimes what happens to people too. So you can't just be superstitious and say, I don't want to learn about how my mind interfaces with the spiritual plane, because it's doing it all the time. And a lot of negative thoughts and suicidal thoughts, that's an entity. It's not even really you at your heart and core. So essentially the eighth sphere is formed, which is the lower astral plane, which is like all of our dark thoughts and our nightmares and our lower emotions and all the entities that wear those as clothes, and fallen angels and human souls that are like lost and degenerated. And it's every bit of a nightmare that you would think. And so there is no, you can't just open up and say, oh, I'm just gonna, you know, I'm just gonna tune in and just anything that comes through, just expect it to be a holy source. That's like a Lemurian perspective, which a lot of people still have. They haven't developed that updated perspective yet. They still think it just open up and everything will be great. There's no darkness. And there's this real naivety still, because again, there was a state where people were like that and it was fine to be like that. But we have to evolve into the correct station for the time, right? So eventually you'll see in theosophy, spirit, sometimes in spiritualism and in anthroposophy, you start to see like a different perspective on mediumship and channeling. And they start to discourage it. And they start to say that this is not something that anybody should do unless they're educated. So this you see way more in anthroposophy. It's a lot softer in theosophy. But in the anthroposophical system, you really start to see Steiner saying things like that, like, you cannot just open up to whatever you want, because humanity is in the darkest hour. So the focus has to be on attunement. You have to attune to God within you, to Christ within your heart. You have to be a fire, ablaze with the Christ impulse. You have to purify your own soul through love, through service, through looking at your wounds, through being with your wounds, through doing all the personal work. And then once you walk through those deserts, once you cry yourself to sleep in pain because you're looking at your trauma, once you go through that and you learn to manage it, and you pray and you pray and you pray and you tune and you ask God to enter your heart, then maybe you're attuned. to begin communing. And so technically also I have to say that psychics, real good psychics, were always attuned. Like, part of the feminine mysteries and the mystery schools, even if they were co-ed, was attuning females to be able to communicate with the masters, to be able to communicate with the higher kingdoms of life that we would fall out of memory of. So women were specifically attuned, specifically trained in order to do this for many, many, many different lives. Would have happened in Atlantis, earlier periods. So there is also a lot of past life stuff involved where a real Sibyl, a real Pythia, a real oracle would not be a medium. Open up to anything, speak it out, any force, any manipulative, whatever. A real Sibyl, a real Pythia, a real oracle would be attuned to communicate with certain forces and would have gone through certain initiations in her lifetimes in order for her to have that connection. So when you're talking about mediumship and attunement and psychic connection, you're looking probably at someone who probably should have been initiated into this many different times, also in past lives. It's not just like what you have in this life. That's what spirituality is like. You look at all of your lives if you really want to understand a phenomenon within you. So the real Pythias, the real Melisses, the real priestesses would have gone through training and attunements and received initiations and markings and all of this kind of stuff from masters and from great initiates that would attune them so that they can connect. So you have to be attuned, which means you have to be at a certain point of development. But anybody can be psychic, but not everybody has attunement. That came from initiation. So that's the real secret there in the mystery school sense and the priestesses sense, the oracles, the idea of the oracle, or these women that were very attuned. They were attuned to communicate with certain planetary spirits or to communicate with the masters, which would be the positive aspect, which would enter into the positive aspect of their etheric body to their negative aspect. There's a whole science to this, is what I'm trying to say. There's a science to psychic development. There's a science to initiation. There's a science to attunement. It's mysterious, but then also can be known, can be remembered. Okay, how are you guys doing out there? I just want to remind you that I do this every 2 weeks on my channel as well. So if you're enjoying this, don't forget to sign up, and also to sign up for my newsletter. We're going to do a couple more questions here. Okay. Okay. This one is from a member. Orange has always been one of my favorite colors. Being around the color even lifts my mood. What is the spiritual significance behind the orange ray? I know orange is associated with the lower realms, astral realms. What positive aspects come from these realms? I know perception of the lower realms is often tainted by the dark forces that reside there. Sometimes I wonder if this is why many people aren't fond of orange. I'd love to hear your take. You know what, it's funny. It's like, I feel like a lot of people's favorite colors are like blue and green. And a lot of people kind of leave like orange and yellow to the wayside. Although my dad's favorite color is yellow. And I think that makes him a very special man. So yeah, I mean, orange is basically the orange ray or the second ray, and there's lots of information that can be found on the orange ray when you look at the study of the rays. So there's an entire study. A lot of it is through theosophy, but you can also find some in like a kind of a physics hybrid of just the second ray or the orange ray. There's whole teachings you can find on that. And the lower astral the lower astral plane, for the planet is basically everybody's nightmare stuff. But for the individual, the lower astral plane may be a lot clearer than other people. So individually, the lower astral plane represents you, and then it can be viewed on a planetary level as the collective consciousness sort of thing. And yeah, people really, we do have a lot of fear around the lower planes because you know what? They're absolutely terrifying. There's a natural fear. Some of the experiences I've had with the eighth sphere and the beings there, it's like the terror can be so great. But if you really tune into it when you're having an experience there with like an entity from there, what I began to notice is that it's like the fear is almost pushed into you. So it's almost like they resonate so much of it, it kind of brings it out of you and it invites you to feel it. But it's not coming necessarily directly from within you. It's like that's an entity, that's a being that is full of that terrifying energy and uses it for power and to feed on things. So it introduces you to that. But if you can become very self-aware and very emotionally aware and aware of your mind, then when you experience that, there's like a division. So it doesn't automatically affect you. So actually interacting with these beings and being in the lower planes, it actually teaches us how to develop our mind and our emotions. It lets us know when we are not slowing down enough. It lets us know when we are not, you know, when our mind is out of control and when we're not sort of separating ourselves from our emotions. If you go in the astral for 2 seconds, the lower astral, the eighth sphere, astrally, you will feel every bit of out of balancedness that you have. You will feel very viscerally how out of balance you are. You will not feel that on earth, but when you go into the eighth sphere by accident or in a dream or something, you will immediately be aware of how imbalanced your mind is, how imbalanced your emotions are. It becomes obvious. The fears that you have become super obvious. So in that sense, it's really a realm of like self-knowledge through you know exposing your own darkness to you. So it's there for a reason, but it legitimately is terrifying. Like that's what it feels like. And so only through those experiences can we basically, sometimes you just get so fed up, right? You're like, okay, no, I'm not, no more, sometimes that's what it is for me. And so it is useful. It's not like there isn't a use for the eighth sphere and the island of misfit toys that exist there. There is a use for that spiritually. Okay, this is another member question. Can you speak about sleepwalking, please? Is something else entering my body during a dream and takes it for a walk? Thank you. Happy Sunday. Well, happy Sunday. And I think a couple things could happen during, somnambulism or sleepwalking and things like that. I think many different occasions. I think that the body is basically just expressing whatever is going on in the astral plane. So the body is just not paralyzed and it's actually doing whatever it's doing in a dream or something like that. And then other times, I think it's possible that a spirit or an entity could also be in contact. But I think the first example is much more common. It's you're physically carrying out something that you're experiencing astrally in your dream. I don't think that sleepwalking is like some sign of like possession or anything like that. Okay. Rodrigo, my question is about self-sacrifice. What happens when a being dissolves themselves to give us their essence so that we can evolve? Do they go back to the beginning and start all over again in order to get back their individuality as thoughts, as another being? But when they get to the angel stage of evolution, they become exalted beings for having sacrificed themselves. Will such sacrifices be demanding to all of us eventually? Okay, great questions here. So I have some lectures in my series or my playlist called the Creation Series. And near the end of that series, I get into the sacrifice of the angels, specifically the angels of Venus, because that's how we know the most about this, is through the Eden period or the Lemurian period, where basically angelic beings sacrifice a portion of their own essence. And when they do that, we get the energy of mind. We suddenly get the organ of mind, and we get the spark, the first kind of spark of the eye. So in that sense, it's like, well, what is that like for the angels? There is an anthroposophical author, and I think the last name is Kulias, and she did a phenomenal lecture on the prior incarnations of Christ. And I really could, because the prior incarnations of Christ, meaning the prior sacrifices that Christ did before he entered Jesus, because the Christ being has been working with the planet much longer and will continue to beyond the one time we know about. You can look at that as an example of what the angels did as well. So how she described it, and I thought, wow, that's so well done, is she described it as a kind of death or excarnation. So in other words, it's how it's experienced by the angels is kind of like a death or kind of like a going to sleep. And then it's like they pass into this plane, and there's certain actions or activities or certain alchemical reactions or activities that happen in the spiritual plane. And that is what actually creates the shift in human consciousness. So it's sort of like through the death process of a higher being, it comes into us. So it's kind of like that really also gets into why, when Christ died, why was that able to change the etheric body of humanity? Why did Jesus's Christ as Jesus' blood in the earth change the etheric body of the earth? How is that possible? Right? How is it possible that through that rite and through the incarnation of Christ in a man, in Jesus, how did that give us the essence of Christ in our heart? How did it make it so it was inside of us? This is the same question. It's the same kind of dynamic, but in earlier periods, it was angelic hierarchies that were doing the same kind of process in which they sacrifice themselves or they experience a kind of death or great sleep. And through that process, they offer of themselves something that humanity then receives. They receive it through the energy bodies of the earth, and then it enters as a faculty eventually into the human being. So it's really important to understand this, because as I talk about here a lot on my channel, this weird idea that human beings are created in like a lab, like Sitchin, or the hybridization stuff is just crap. Like it literally exists, at least in my mind, to stop the understanding of how we came to be and how we evolve. It stops the understanding of Christ, of angels, and it just creates this bizarre scientific thing. So we have to be really careful that, like, it's such an elegant and complex, beautiful system of initiation that when you get to a certain point as an angel, you have the opportunity to sacrifice of yourself for the beings beneath you. Not all angels choose that path. There are some angels, and I think they're called, I love the Eastern traditions for this, because there's there's some like angel, I think they call them Buddhas, that are the still Buddhas that watch. I cannot remember the name, but they're basically the angels that um, they don't sacrifice their actual soul for humanity. They, with their mind, they pour in, and they just help in a spiritual sense. They become lesser involved, but they still help, they still assist, but not to the degree that the sacrificing angels do. That's my understanding. So this is a special class, it seems. And so how the experience for them is basically that they end up connecting with and overshadowing a human being. So they don't necessarily like forget things the way that we do, or they're not like in a human body from the same perspective that like an average person would be. What they do is they surround and they work upon a human. And this is a bodhisattva. This is the Buddha, right? So a Buddha is someone who is being, led or has merged with their aura. A archangel, right, is a higher angelic being, is literally part of their soul. Okay, so you're receiving that essence, that influence. That's always what a high initiate has been. It means that you have a high angel overarching you as part of your being. And this teaching is present in anthroposophy through the idea of the spiritual economy, and the idea that the astral sheath and the etheric sheath that you have is shared too. So when a certain initiate gets to a certain phase, like Christ, like Jesus, for example, he transcends the need for certain spiritual bodies that would be interacting with the physical body in a physical life. He develops the astral and etheric body to a point of perfection, and then a copy of them enters and is available for certain initiates who are ready for them. So there are certain people after the incarnation of Jesus that actually wore his astral body and his etheric body. So this is called spiritual economy in anthroposophy. So this is also mentioned in the Eastern traditions as well, this idea of these great initiates that will pass on the flame to someone else. And so when you get to a very, very high level, you pass off your etheric and astral bodies to someone else, but you have to get someone to your level to do that. So there's all sorts of dynamics to initiation like this that we should understand, that involve the development of your spiritual bodies. That's really what this is about. You're not going to get this through adding a chip to your brain. You're not going to get this through modifying your genes. You can't modify your genetics to be a great initiate, a spiritual master. You can just mess up your physical form so badly that now you can't even feel the spiritual world, because you've changed your natural form to such a degree that it's not even real anymore. It's just synthetic. Okay, the only way that you transubstantiate matter, that you get off of the earth, you can't go colonize different worlds and think that this is a spiritual thing to do. We transubstantiate the actual matter of the earth and enter a higher plane. And we do that through this process of initiation, which involves the purification and even taking on different astral and etheric bodies of different initiates, in which they are shared within the higher spiritual organization, like the spiritual hierarchies. So they don't go back to the beginning. They don't like start over again. The way that I understand it is that they enter into a body as a angelic influence, basically. And the I becomes more and more developed, and a piece of that is carried within that person, if that makes sense. It's kind of complex, and I'll definitely get into it more if you guys want at a later date. But right now, the most important thing to understand on this topic is that higher angelic beings will sacrifice themselves to create certain impulses on the earth. And those impulses go on to create certain spiritual organs of perception and evolve. So human evolution comes through the sacrifice of great beings. This is why we don't view the cosmos as a simulation as well. Because if you view the cosmos as a simulation, you're certainly not going to be able to understand the sacrifice of an angelic being to bring in the faculty of mind, which means you're not going to understand your own initiation and how to spiritualize the mind and transform and do inner alchemy, right? So this is that aspect. The aspect of understanding the spiritual hierarchies of human initiation is absolutely imperative. It's absolutely key. If we could understand only a few things that would give us the most results in our life for this period, that would be it, because there's so much stuff saying otherwise. Okay. This one is from Pame or Pame. Hi, Gigi. Thank you for your priceless work. I was wondering how to connect to Jesus. I get that, where is it? I get that he is always within our hearts, but I don't seem to be in a frequency very high these days, so I'm not connecting to very happy entities. What do you do? Did you ever get to see him? Thanks again. You are a gift. Oh, thank you, Pame. So, yeah, I would say that it's totally, it's completely normal to feel like you're not in the flow and that you feel like you can't sense angels around you or you can't sense Christ. Being human is really hard, especially right now in the world. I really feel like with the corruption that we're dealing with the inversions, I feel like this life is like 10 lives in another time. So don't be hard on yourself because you don't feel like you can get into the crying ecstasy of spiritual joy because you don't feel like you're entering nirvana. That by no means is saying anything about what's possible for you, or who you are. We all go through phases like that, and there are a couple things that really do tend to work. Is first of all, that essence, that presence of Christ is always within your heart, whether you feel it or not. It is always within your heart, and it is always working upon you. So pray and say his name and call it into your heart and acknowledge it as much as possible. And that will help to make it more visible for you. There's this concept that I've always found fascinating. It kind of relates to homeopathy, but it actually goes back to the Vedic tradition, which is that if you can say something 100,000 times, it will distill the essence within you. And this was sort of like an old secret of, I think, certain Eastern mystery schools, and why they would repeat mantras is that the idea is that we were surrounded by all of these great forces, these angels, these great masters and initiates, many of which we don't even know their names, that work upon us. Yet we couldn't sense them and we couldn't feel them. We were struck away from them. We were blinded and we were surrounded in our own emotions, in which we would build up inside of us. We wouldn't know what to do. And so what these Eastern mystery schools would do, and a lot of Western ones too, is that they would use repetition. And their whole thing was, the whole secret in this teaching was that if you would say something 100,000, now this is a lot, but this is what they said, that essence would become completely conscious and aware in your worldview. And so it's like, sometimes you think it's like, have you prayed on something 100,000 times? And maybe it's less than that for many people, because that was a different period. But the idea is that pray on the energies, the force that you want in your life again and again and again, like a mantra. And so there's lots of different prayers to have Christ enter your life. Find one that resonates with you. I love a very simple one, like something like, well, there's very traditional ones, like you can use, Lord Jesus, please have mercy on me, which is a beautiful prayer. But you can just go and read anything. There's traditional ones that are more orthodox. There's more ones that you can create. Figure out what one works for you. And if you're wanting to really connect, because you're saying here with Jesus, then use the name and find one that really works for you, that you really feel. And that is going to call that force into your life and make it more familiar to you. Because remember, the force is always there. You're never alone. You're never walking alone. It's just that we don't realize it's there. So by saying the name and calling it in again and again and again and again, that's how we break through and we chip away the distance that's between us and the spiritual world. So it's through prayer, it's through repetition, and you say it out loud. You say it again and again and again. Sometimes I go throughout the whole day and I just chant. I just call on Christ, or I chant. So that is what can raise you, because what you're doing is you're saturating yourself in the name. And so it's like we have to work to attune ourselves to Spirit, to the Holy Spirit, to Christ. We have to work to do that. It's always there, but we have to work to notice it. We have to be grateful for it when it's around. So it's always present, but sometimes we have to consciously call it out and interact with it to make it more obvious in our life. And I find that that really does work. And yes, I have had my own experiences with Christ. Part of my, I would say, like personal development was seeing parts of Christ's life. And this came through actually me just in meditation much later in life, I think, than most people. And I just started to see these men in basically white robes, and I just saw their feet. They were like sandaled, bare feet. And they would just always like be walking around, and I would just kind of look at the feet and look at the white robes. And then eventually, I had a very negative view of Christianity because I felt like I wasn't accepted into Christianity because I was psychic and because I was, interested in spiritual things, and like I just felt like there was no place for me. And I think a lot of people feel that way when that's absolutely not true. That was me thinking that dogmatic Christianity is Christianity, and that was my mistake. So when I actually started to interact with masters within the Christ impulse, or Western masters and angels, and saw Christ, then everything changed for me. And there's a point with this where, like, I can sit here and I can tell you my experiences. I can tell you the spiritual science behind the doctrine of resurrection the best that I possibly can. I do not think I'm an expert on it at all. I can only share what I understand. I can share about the Christ impulse and how it operates and interesting things about it. But you have to have an experience to really understand it. And this is the thing with spirituality, is that it's mysterious when people come into certain understandings. We don't know why. It has to do with the nature of their soul. So everybody has their time. And so it's just important to respect everyone wherever they are and to work from compassion and love, because everyone has their time and everyone has their experience. The way that we bridge it, again, is through understanding objective spiritual laws, including initiation, including the reality of spiritual masters and how you can become that. All of these things are important. But so I've had my own experiences with Jesus, with different adepts and masters, I would say, are in the Christ stream. It's Western for me. And yeah, they really shaped my life. And I had memories of being involved with different aspects of the Christ impulse in other lives. And it became something that is so important into my life, in my life. And many times I think that when I look at like the dogmatic version of it, it just doesn't really feel, it feels different than the esoteric. And that's also something that I contrast, is the difference between the two. But anyway, I'm going to do one more question here. Okay, this one is from Huck. Okay, I'm actually going to address a question people are asking about Isis Rising and other videos on my channel that are gone. Okay, so there's some videos on my channel that I took down. My channel was getting struck for certain videos. So YouTube was actually striking them and removing them. I don't know why. The videos had been up, the video had been up for like a couple years. And so the reason why they were striking it was because of medical misinformation, because I had been speaking about this thing. And so I had a choice. I could leave certain videos up that addressed this, and there were many, or I could remove them and start a process of uploading them on to my private website, and even maybe even Rumble. I didn't think about that, but basically to my website. So I had to go through all the videos, and many of the lectures had a question and answer section. A couple of them did, where people were asking about this thing. And so I removed them. And they're now probably going to be uploaded onto my private platform. Some of them there was a few that I removed because I'm going to re-lecture on them. So I'm going to reintroduce the topic. But most of the stuff that is removed from my channel was because it was talking about this, and YouTube started striking videos on my channel. And my thought was that it's very easy to basically lose your channel if YouTube just decides to go in and strike and remove every video where I've talked about something, and then I won't have a channel. It would be a very good way to retroactively essentially remove someone. And I figured that it's far enough along now that even my answers and stuff were probably talked about a million times. So I decided to remove them. Some of the videos I didn't really remove anything from Isis Rising that I know of. It was mainly Q&As, but some of them, oh yeah, no, the thing about Isis Rising actually is really funny to do with censorship, is that my Isis Rising videos were also getting plugged as being like they were getting dinged because of the word ISIS. And I guess people were I don't know why, but they were saying it was like some of the videos got tagged because they were like they thought it was talking about ISIS, like the Islamic terrorist groups. And then some of them were getting tagged like for being sexual, as though it was like porn or something. So there's been a bit of a battle with YouTube, and there was a bit of a crackdown at the beginning of the year. And so I did end up pulling some videos, mainly some lectures and some Q&As from 2020 and 2021, when there was the height of the medical thing, in an effort to preserve my channel. And so I figured I'll move these behind, upload them somewhere else, and be able to continue to connect with you here. Pretty sad state of affairs when you have this kind of bizarre censorship dance that you have to do. Completely weird and sad, but that's the reality. So they will all eventually appear this year for sure on my private platform. Some of them are still probably on Rumble for sure, but yeah, YouTube is um is it's not a free speech platform, I'll say that. Okay, so here is the last question. Okay, Gigi, what if one tries to come from the Christ impulse, but one fails? Are you destined then to return to this exact realm to try again? What if one tries to come from the Christ impulse? Okay, so like an angel or a master, but fails. Are you destined to then return to this exact realm to try again? Yeah, so this is talking about, the Christ impulse is a great word because it acknowledges that there's sort of this one way in which we experience the Christ being is sort of as an impulse or an energy. It is a being, but we experience that way. And when there's angels and higher beings that are coming from within that Christ impulse and at our higher station within the Christ being, they take on the risk, obviously, of entering into this realm. And so you do see angels that initially offer themselves, like Lucifer is a great example of this. You see Lucifer as the highest angel, right? And then you see his fall, because even when an angel is offering themselves, they are going through an initiation in their own right, in their own life. It's not the same as Earth and as humanity's, but it is still something. It's their initiation. So when they fail, if they fail their initiation, and you basically get the story of fallen angels and Lucifer, and you become sort of trapped in this realm until you're redeemed and until you can develop the quality or the organ, the kind of essence that you really wanted to, which is because when angels interact with humanity, they're sort of building up something within themselves as well. They have a task as well. So if that's not developed, then they can fall into basically a devolution pathway, just like a human being can, which is, I know it's really crazy to think about, but fallen angels and beings that fall out of the spiritual hierarchy is within every religion. You know, they just use different languages, like the asuras. The asuras are just beings that fell out of the human life wave or development in the Saturn period. And there's different names for this phenomenon of angels falling and beings falling, great cosmic beings falling. You have the archons, which is just like kind of another word for archai, really, or archangel or archai. It's like the Gnostic version of the angelic hierarchies. So yeah, if they enter into a covenant with humanity and they offer something of themselves and they are unable to fulfill their task, then they can fall into obviously delusion and will have to be redeemed, which is the teachings of Lucifer and Ahriman reveal this, in that Lucifer, even though he's a fallen entity, he has the capacity to be redeemed. And so the more selfless we become, the more in service we are to each other, the more that we develop that love. Because remember, Lucifer is sort of like the spark of mind. Lucifer isn't even completed knowledge or completed wisdom. It's just he's a spark of mind, because he fell very early in human development. So he doesn't actually contain the developments that many of the other angels do, and even to some degree human beings do. But he's still united with humanity through his sacrifice and through what he did offer. So by us becoming compassionate, by us becoming loving, by us becoming of service, and becoming Christ-like, we actually redeem Lucifer. And so Lucifer is set through humanity to one day be redeemed. So there is something to do not only with the fall of angels and the fall of people from grace, but also the redemption and what it takes to redeem and be redeemed. And this gets into some very beautiful teachings about forgiveness, about interconnectedness, our interconnectedness, how powerful compassion is, how powerful love is, and these teachings about redemption that are also very key in esoteric Christianity as well. So I'm going to do a few shout outs. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. We really chatted a lot. So thank you, Dario Darkangelo, Anne Leon, Annie Leon, Andy Leon, Norman Smith, and Metaphysical Mike. Thank you guys so much for joining me today. Those were some incredible questions. What a phenomenal discussion we've had. As I mentioned, I will be here, well, not on YouTube, but I will be doing audience questions again next week, but I'll be doing that on my private platform. So if you want to do this all again next week, I'd love to have you. If not, sign up for my newsletter at gigiyoung.com so you can stay up to date on whenever I'm going to lecture or do one of these, so you can get your question in and we can hang out. So thank you guys so much, as always, for hanging out with me today. Amazing questions, great work, and I will see you all very soon.